Welcome to the Mad Ones. I'm your definitely respects women, even though they definitely belong in the kitchen host, Cam Harless. And with me tonight is your Eats Tofurkey on Purpose guest host, Cody Cook of Cantus Firmus. How you doing, Cody?
How you doing? Hey, I appreciate you having me on here. I was surprised, honestly, because not only am I a man,
Yeah, it's true.
but or at least identify as one, but also you're a big celebrity now. I mean, I figured you'd be too busy hanging out with Glenn Greenwald and the Tucker Carlson green room to talk to the likes of me. But I think it really shows what a humble and down to earth person you are that you'd have me on again, and as a co-host, even.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I have become. It's so funny. People are saying that I'm famous. I'm like, I now have 7,000 Twitter followers. If that's famous, your standards are lower than mine. But yeah, I was on Tucker Carlson, and it was odd.
Yeah. Well, I've never been on Tucker Carlson. I think I've got 12 Twitter followers, so you're still ahead of me.
Well, I'm going to ask you now. What have you been up to? Because I don't think when was the last time we spoke on the show? We talked about
we
Enemy
were on
Love.
D'Angelo, I think. Enemy Love, yeah.
Yeah.
John's great. Love John. Yeah, I've been trying to stay busy. I'm getting ready for a new baby. Writing some different articles and trying to find homes for them. And I'm trying to learn how to write children's books because I've got some ideas for a couple. So working on that a little bit. And that's kind of me, man. How about you?
Just living, breathing, thriving.
Yeah.
I'm essentially taking over Monica's spot on the propaganda report. It's not official yet, but it does happen a lot now. So I've been very busy. That and it's the super busy season in my job. So I've been like just full blast, full bore for the last couple of weeks, and I'm just exhausted, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
But let's do this show thing because we were late. I'm sorry, guys. I'm dumb. And when me and the guest talked about the time, I did not read what he said apparently, because in my mind I'd said 8:30 and I just did not read. I'm dumb, and you should not watch stuff that I do, though I appreciate it. But before we get started, I do want to let you know that this show is 100% brought to you by fans and patrons. So hit like, subscribe, and share the show with your friends. There are all sorts of topics that we've covered inside and outside of Christianity, so share them with someone who might gain something from them. Also, if you want to catch occasional early episodes, Zoom hangouts, and gain my eternal gratitude, you can hit up patreon.com/themadOnes. Also, I just released brand new shirts because you saw the new intro, and I have to make a new one every time I do a new like theme with the logo. So those are now up at wearethemadOnes.com/store. And also, I had my beautiful wife actually design a feminine shirt for us. So we did something for the ladies. You can check that out there as well. It's very pretty and not something I would have ever made because I'm just not feminine. You believe that, right? I've been trying to convince people my whole life. But let's get to the show. So joining the Mad Ones tonight is a man of study. He's a husband, a father. He's a New Testament nerd. He's got a bachelor's, a master's, and is currently working on his PhD on the apocalyptic Paul. He's ordained and is currently on YouTube. Not right now. Well, I mean, he is. He will be in a second. But he has a YouTube channel that's the New Testament Theologist. And you can join him in rigorous theological analysis of the New Testament. So please welcome Mr. Nick Quient. I'm so glad that I asked you how to pronounce your last name because I would have thrown that "ient" in there, like for sure.
Mm-hmm. Everyone does. Half the time I just let them and then correct them after just to watch their expression like, oh my God, I did it wrong. I'm like, had you asked, like Cam, you all would have been good, but thank you for that very kind introduction.
You're welcome. I do like to ask. There have been a few people that I was like, okay, so how do you say your name? Because I don't want to be that guy that has to be corrected on screen for saying the name wrong. But yeah, so over the last couple of months, I've been not deeply studying, but thinking about the role of women in ministry, and how that is supposed to work, especially with some of the last book I read and some of the concept I've been meandering through and thinking about. And so I kind of want to have this conversation. I want to hear the the argument for women in ministry, because there are a lot of people who talk against it, and so I kind of know all of their arguments for the most part. And so I wanted to have you come on, because that's I found you because our mutual friend Chris Date,
Yeah.
who I think we're all conditionalists here, by the way, unless you're not.
No, I am.
Yeah, so it's Chris Date has been on and off saying things about complementarianism versus egalitarianism, which I feel like these words don't really work as well as you'd think in these circumstances. I feel like better words could be used. And he tagged you, and I was like, okay. And so thank you, Chris Date. But another funny thing was when we were in that space between where I thought we were going to start the show and you thought we were going to start the show. I was like, okay, what can we do? That's an hour. I can still keep it on schedule. And I called another friend named Nick that I haven't spoken to in like 2 or 3 years, who is on the other side. And I was like, maybe he's not busy. Maybe for the first hour he can give his take. And then when the other Nick comes in, we could have a battle of the Nicks. But he leaves, and then you give your argument, because I don't want to do debates. I don't like debates. That's not my thing. Right. But I do want you to be able to get into that and get into your argument for it. But before we do that, I gave you an introduction, but I think it's best if people tell us about themselves, because I could have missed anything. So tell us a little bit about where you are, who you are, and how you got to this position, if you will.
Sure. And how's it going, Cody? Long time no talk. Good to see you too.
Yeah, man. Good to see you.
Married to Allison. We live in Southern California. Looking to move as soon as the Lord wills it. Hopefully someplace hotter and less crazy.
We're in Florida, and it's more crazy in a different way, but in a good way.
I could deal with that kind of crazy. That kind of crazy I could deal with. Did my master's in New Testament, PhD student, very, very, very slowly. Was a pastor for, it's like 3 years and 7 months technically. So, but it's like, do I round that down to 3, or do I round that down to 4, round it up to 4? So I just go with 4 years, 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
Was a pastor there for a while. This issue is one of those issues that, I hate calling it an issue, but it is one of those things where you're kind of born into it, regardless of whatever opinion. If you're Episcopalian, you're born into a certain, at least, way of thinking about the conversation,
right.
Or Southern Baptist or whomever. I was raised in a Calvary Chapel background, which is essentially Southern Baptist, but more charismatic.
Yeah, and I was raised charismatic.
Yeah, so you know exactly what I went through. So cheers to you on that.
But Cam, you're still a pretty charismatic guy, I think.
Oh yeah, I still definitely. I'm not a cessationist whatsoever.
Oh, I'm a continuationist 100%. I'm just not charismatic.
Right.
I think you're charismatic, Nick.
No, I'm definitely not. I need more of this, and I'm certainly not going to be.
I was going to say, it's not that hard to be more charismatic than the Southern Baptist.
That's true. Very. My family wasn't like that, but pretty, just patriarchal. Everything's assumed a certain way, and there's no kind of conversation about it, And then, I went to Biola, met my wife, and she didn't feel called to ministry, and she still doesn't. But it was one of those, hey, if we're going to date, I've got an opinion on this. She'd written tons of papers on it. She had gone through all of that. She was raised in an American Baptist context that was egalitarian in the sense of it was assumed, but you didn't have to be egalitarian. And that's kind of one of the perks of being American Baptist is denominationally we're egalitarian, but at the same time we're Baptist. So that comes with its own local church kind of deciding how that all works out. So, but she had wrestled with it and came to a changed conclusion. She didn't believe in women in ministry, or at least egalitarianism, I should say. And we can parse those terms out later. I'm with you. I hate the terms. I don't think they mean anything. But she challenged me to go back and study, and I studied it for about a year and then moved from complementarianism to egalitarianism, but I still had questions that took about 5 years for me to settle on.
Gotcha.
I'm the kind of person that I'm very slow to change my mind, for better or worse. It's not because I'm stubborn, but because I don't like to be wrong. Yeah. I'm big on that. So it took me a very long time to change my mind. And I still have a few questions here and there that I like resolved, but But yeah, changed my mind. Then went to seminary, learned more Greek, and then ended up here in Southern California, looking for pastoral ministry work and trying to stay sane in unsane times.
Were you saying your wife was complementarian when you met her?
No, she was egalitarian, but she had become, she was raised in an egalitarian context.
Mm-hmm.
Had become, and this is from a long conversation ago, we haven't talked about this recently, but was at least, I think her and her dad had a debate about it a lot, like when she was much younger, and he was egalitarian in the church, complementarian-ish in the home, kind of, and that's of course separate things. But he changed her mind on it, and she then changed his mind on marriage and all that sort of stuff. But that was over a period of years and studying. She had lots of people who, encouraged her to do academic work and study. She's doing her PhD now too in systematic theology at Aberdeen. But she challenged me to just, go back to the Bible and study it for yourself, because if you're dating someone who thinks she could be called to ministry, she just didn't think she was, but could be called to ministry, it's going to be harder on you with your friends, given where I come from. And it certainly wasn't fun. But part of that was my problem, being stubborn and wanting to fight about it. And hopefully the Lord has sanded off some of those rough edges since then. But yeah, generally speaking, that's kind of the picture.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let me do this. Normally, this is the point in time when Jessica, my co-host who's on a break right now, would say, what are these words that you're using? Could you explain them so that everyone knows what you're saying?
Sure. And these are the terms that people have settled on. You and I probably agree these are not good terms. But complementarian at its core affirms that men and women are equal in terms of dignity and value before a holy God. But men have been given a specific role as spiritual provider, leader, servant leader, however you want to phrase that up, in the home and in the church, although there is debate over if that extends to the church or not. Allison's Greek professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Grant Osborne, was egalitarian in church and complementarian in home, and saw no conflict there. So there is nuance in the debate as far as that goes. But the idea is that men are given a sort of special role to be certain providers or leaders in the home in a way that puts them, you might say, at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. And that, just in terms of putting a crude analogy, it's not the best analogy, but that at least give people an image of it. Egalitarian affirms both equality, and I hate the term equality already, but the equality in role and in giftedness and all that sort of stuff, but doesn't see hierarchy as the base of the distinction. They see gender differences as the base of the distinction. Whereas in complementarianism, the belief, generally speaking, depends on the complementarian, but generally speaking, the differences are highlighted in terms of hierarchy, which include biological differences. Egalitarians basically go, we don't affirm the hierarchical aspect of that, but we affirm gender distinctions. I can't have a baby. As much as I might want to try, I can't have a baby. And even with all our scientific advances today, I still don't think I'd want to have a baby, given what I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to. Hell no.
I have 5. That's too many. I have enough. I'm set.
So it's almost better to think of it in terms of you have, and it's a bad term to use, but you would say something like hierarchicalist. But even then, I have no problem with hierarchy in church. There's pastors and people in charge, like the church functions that way. So patriarchy is a bad word for it because of the negative connotations, but you would say something like male overseer or oversight in the home and or in the church versus shared oversight in the home or in the church, because both sides believe in complementarity, that men and women are different and we complement each other. What she can do, I can't do. What I can do, she can't do. And that feeds into it, so to speak. And that leaves out true patriarch, which means women are genetically inferior, which is kind of the old traditional view until like the 1800s or so. And that leaves out modern feminism, which basically is women either are identical to men, which I would disagree with, or women are superior, matriarchalism. And egalitarianism, in my mind, I would prefer the term mutualism, is situated kind of in the middle between both of those extremes, with complementarianism being closer to the hierarchical or patriarchal model, but not itself patriarchal, or at least within that realm. So that's, in a nutshell, the nerdiest way I can say it without going on for another 15 minutes.
So I do want to bring up a point related, but before I do that, I have a growing list of words that we use that I think are too muddy for us to be using the way that we do. I think for one, I think we can all agree on this: hell. Like that's a word that's almost not helpful at all anymore.
Yeah, it's a garbage word. It doesn't say anything. It's like the word spiritual. It doesn't mean anything. You have to explain it so much.
Yeah. And so another one I think is also, like we talked about, complementarian and egalitarian, because they're both such loaded terms. Because like if the way my brain works, when I hear complementarianism, I don't think about hierarchies. I think about how we're different and we work together and we more or less complete one another. And so like that's what that means to me, but it's not what that means in this context. And so it's extremely frustrating to me. But
and that term was actually used by the early feminists too. They actually, I think we found, I don't have the citation in front of me. I can go find it if someone asks later. But early feminists in like the 18 and 1900s used that sort of language to describe how they perceive the God-human relationship and the male-female relationship. So it's not a new term. It's kind of grounded in the abolitionist feminist fundamentalists, actually, you'd probably call them today, movement that women actually, Margaret Fell and all of them that kind of pioneered that.
Well, in I'll give you two more. One that I think is pretty unhelpful is the word soul. To be honest. And then the final one is the biggest one that I'm trying to, I think that the word God is unhelpful in a lot of ways, because there's so much because it's like, if you look at the English, you go into a dictionary and you see God with a little g, that means someone who is not Yahweh.
Right.
And then if you see the capital G, that means Yahweh. But this is the same word. And there's so much. Elohim is used in multiple different ways in the Bible, and it's a title, and people assume it's their name. I think it's less helpful than I used to think. I mean, it's a title. It's not a name, and people act like it's a name. But I think it's unhelpful, and I'm trying to work out my feelings on that at this point, among other things.
When you have the hijacking of, and we see this in all sorts of debates everywhere, just across the political theological spectrum, words no longer have fixed meanings. And if they do have fixed meanings, they change so quickly that, 5 minutes later, you're talking about, well, what is the soul? And then 5 minutes later, it's like, what are we even talking about here? There's so much to this. And so it's one of those where you almost have to drill down and go, okay, do we all agree that these words are, of course, nuanced, complicated, have their histories, have their developments, but have some sort of base meaning? We can all kind of go, okay, we can build on this sort of meaning, even if we take it and build a house like this, an apartment over here, and like build on it like that. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah, well, and especially when it comes to God, because when you say that word, I mean, geographically, it means different things. It also has a very personal meaning for a lot of people, because people understand God according to how they were taught or according to their life experience. So it's already muddied before you get to talking about the actual character and being of Yahweh. And so it's like, how can we fix this? I don't know. But I really love that conversation, because it's, as I've grown, I only have a bachelor's degree in biblical studies, because I do not have the money for that, and I can't go into any more debt. But as I'm reading, and I feel like I've learned so much more outside of college than I did in, if I'm being honest. I feel like that's crazy, but no, I love these conversations, and I love going through things. So, Cody, do you have anything you want to say before I push into the conversation?
Yeah, maybe to kind of shift back a little bit to Nick's presentation of the definitions. One thing I kind of appreciated was that he was sort of lopping off the extremes, because when you first said egalitarians believe in differences, I thought, well, not all egalitarians, because but if we're sort of putting these biblical parameters around it, and you could say something about complementarians. There are definitely complementarians that are very patriarchal, that are very chauvinistic, but I think what we're trying to do is kind of look at kind of how the Bible hedges us in different ways here. On the one hand, the Bible tells us a lot of things about the equality of men and women, but it also suggests that there are differences, and perhaps, and this is kind of where the debate lies, different functions as well. And that's kind of where, I think where we're going to find, obviously the argument is being had, but I liked that you were sort of saying, these are kind of the biblical parameters that sort of put us, if not on the same page, at least on, in the same book.
Right. And at least we're arguing over things. So, okay, we can go to this point here. And this is where the conversation is. We're not arguing over that male is, as Mary Daly, the famous historian and philosopher, said, to be, God is male kind of data. We're not talking about that. We're not going the whole, Christianity sexist, this sort of thing. We're kind of, as you said, we're lopping off this sort of, kind of narcissistic talk, if we can be crude about it. This sort of, we're trying to score rhetorical points. And, I got in trouble with my egalitarian friends because I was like, you're just complementarianism. I'll give you a 5-minute and I gave a 5-minute presentation, in church about what complementarian was. And they were like, wait, do you believe this? I said, oh God, no. But this is, if you're going to believe it, believe the best form of it. And no complementarian worth her or his salt believes that, in chauvinism or patriarchalism. So go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think that the first thing that you'll often hear an egalitarian say is that essentially what complementarians are proposing is chauvinism. And the first thing you'll hear a complementarian say about egalitarianism is, well, they're denying that there are differences between men and women. They're making men and women interchangeable. Before long, it's just we're just going to move into lesbianism and whatever, because there's no difference between men and women, and that's what they're saying. Right. And so I appreciate that we're not having these conversations where we sort of make the other side as extreme as possible, and hopefully we can agree that those extremes don't belong in the church.
No, I think it literally creates a sort of theological segregation, to use a loaded term. Because if you see the worst of every side as representative, I mean, we see that in politics, right? It's easy to put up this, straw person here and go, see, that represents the GOP or the Democrats or the Libertarians. Although with the Libertarians, they are kind of their own caricature, if I'm honest. I mean, as a former Libertarian, we kind of are our worst caricature.
As a current Libertarian, I somewhat agree.
Yeah. Stay away from our conventions. They are pure satire, but they're serious, which is even weirder.
What, the libertarian conventions?
Yeah, it basically turns into Reddit embodied, which is a hysterically awful thing to see and witness.
I think the funniest thing that I ever saw was, I don't know if it was a convention or another. My goodness, my I keep having to clear my throat. Didn't want everyone to hear that, and I kind of wanted to hear that. I'm good with the mute. No, one of the funniest things I ever saw in the libertarian world was there was an event, I think it was around the 2016 convention, when Eric July was playing music, and there's this video of the people in the crowd like trying to headbang and stuff, and it was the most cringy, it hurt me to watch. But yeah, no, I'm it's so funny because it's like I'm I don't want to use that phraseology. I'm not libertarian anymore. I'm not connected to the post-libertarian stuff. But I almost feel like now I'm maybe even more so than I was before, because I've just dropped all that crap from my life. Because I don't need it. But let me give you some ground from where I am. Literally 2 or 3 days ago, I finished The Lost World of Adam and Eve by John H. Walton. I don't know if you've read that. But this was kind of, I didn't realize this when I started reading it, but this was a thought that I was having. We have the verse in Galatians. It talks about you're neither male nor female, free, slave nor free, Greek, Jew, whatever. But I've always wondered how this works, because we look at the garden and we see that a lot of these situations and the way we see things are based out of the curse rather than out of the ideal that God had. And so while I was reading this book, I think one of the more interesting points that he made, and I really recommend reading it just to challenge yourself and to stretch your mind and then challenge that and figure it out. I'm in the post moment now where I'm going to go and challenge all of the things that he said and try to suss these things out. But one of the interesting things that he said was he kind of believes that the creation of Adam and Eve could very well have been a vision that Adam saw. And so it wasn't a literal rib necessarily, but it was, the word that's used for rib also means side, like a side of beef. And so he saw it as a cutting in half, which made men and women ontological equals. And so they were equal in their their nature and their standing, and their job that was given in Genesis was to cultivate, to take dominion of this sacred space that was Eden. And so in that kind of way, they were both like priests of Eden. And it seems like there may have been some form of hierarchy in that when you're reading it, but I was sitting there and thinking, why is it that more churches aren't? I mean, I'm not saying that every church needs to have a male pastor or every church needs to have a female pastor, but why aren't there more churches with both working together, like in Eden? So that's where my brain is. That's where my conception is right now. And so, I just want to hear your argument now, because I don't know. I'm in the middle ground of wrestling this out, and let's do it. Let's hit the verses. Let's hit your argument, and let's flesh this out.
Yeah, looking at, if I remember correctly, the Hebrew word, rib is not the best translation for that.
Right.
It would be something like side of beef, but also I think it's Salah. My Hebrew is not as good as my Greek. My Greek's wonderful, but my Hebrew it's been a while. Which is where I got A's in Hebrew and got A minuses in Greek. And I published stuff in Greek. I've not published a single thing in Hebrew. But Salah, if I'm saying that right,
yes, that is correct,
refers to the side not only of objects but of sacred objects. The side of the Solomonic temple, the side of God's holy mountain, which I think Walton's thesis holds, because if that is true, God has assigned a sort of sacredness or sacred architecture to the human person. So when Adam and Eve are, whether it's split or she's taken out of, that kind of imagery, I think splitting is probably the best kind of understanding of how that worked. That's where the vision, I think it's interesting. I think it's a little, I don't think it's wrong. It's just one of those, I'm like, okay, that's a helpful heuristic device to kind of explain how this might have worked. Any more than, God's got dirt under his fingernails because he literally made the earth man, the Adam, Adam, But I think what we see in Genesis 1 and 2, of course, is God's ideal. This is how God wanted creation to function. You have ambassadors or representatives, because that's what the image does. The image represents God in, you might say, human form, which, of course, Jesus does, of course, in a similar but, of course, exalted in different way. So you have Adam and Eve, or at least in Genesis 1, the splitting of, or rather Genesis 2, you have the splitting of the earth person, the earth man. And then you have him calling her, not naming, but calling her. And that calling language is used throughout Genesis 1 and 2 to denote not a naming, but a classification. God named these things. God gave them some sort of, an order, or here's kind of the order or the function of these things. Right. These are, Adam names the animals, and it's not that he's saying, all these things, but he's saying, oh, these are these. It's identifying what the object or the entity or the thing is.
Can I see that in just a second?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, because that was the thing that really hit me when I was reading Genesis the other day, was because if you look at, and I need to just do an ancient cosmology episode at some point, as I love that stuff so much. But
that's fascinating.
Oh, I love it. But you see in Genesis 1, you see God speaking things into existence. You see the terrestrial origins in Genesis 2, but he's speaking things into his existence. He's just, describing them, as you say, he's classifying them, and that's his work of creation. It's ordering. And then the first thing after being called the image of God that Adam does is the exact same work, which is classifying the animals. And so it's very fascinating to me, and it really opened up my eyes to see that the first thing that Adam did was be the image of God. Yeah. And I think that's beautiful. But go ahead, sorry.
No, and I think that's helpful, because what Adam does is he classifies her as bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That sort of that interconnectedness, that people say intimacy. It doesn't really denote intimacy. It denotes a sort of sameness but differentness. There's, that sort of, and it's not derived as in, the famous, I think it's rabbinic. She's not made from his head as to be over him, nor from his feet to be under him, but from his side so that she may stand beside him. And that's what, of course, the helper language, which is unhelpfully translated as helper, means something like literally, and of course, literally, you don't want to translate anything literally, but the idea denotes something, a strength that corresponds or that is in front of him. So kind of this,
Right.
you almost, I mean, to use it's not a biblical example, but you would say you have a yin and yang here almost, just as an image, that sort of interpersonal kind of reality. He recognizes himself as different from her, but recognizes that this is not like the animals. This is not like the plants. This is not like the trees. This is not like, this is a living bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And so I think what I'll just say Moses to make it easy. What Moses is kind of trying to capture in these opening 2 chapters is man is not independent from woman, nor is woman independent from man, but both together constitute the image of God. Both together function as viceroys, as we would say. I think priest is a good rendering of it, because that's what an image does, especially an embodied image. And so that priesthood, that representation, that co-authority over creation, to have dominion over the birds and the beasts and stuff like that, which tells us, of course, and you and I will love this, and Cody, you'll love this too, it's a cosmological statement that creation was not finished. Humanity had to literally till the garden. God didn't give us a finished product on the beach. God gave us creation to subdue. Not you wouldn't say oppress or exploit, but you'd say it became our responsibility to kind of cooperate on this creation together.
It's really interesting. One of the things is the words used change, because when it talks about tilling the earth, it goes from the this is my understanding. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard Tim Mackey talking about this. I love Tim Mackey, by the way. I just
love the guy. He's too smart for all of us.
Oh man, I would love to speak to him. But kind of the way he was talking about it, and one of the things I was listening to was how the word, and I talked to Cody about this before, I think with I don't know which discussion, probably Sabbath or something, in some way, but the word shifted in Hebrew from a word that was essentially like a good word to a word that had a denotation of slavery to it. So they enslaved the ground rather than
You mean after the fall, or
after the fall?
Okay, that makes sense.
There was a shift between the two.
The word in Genesis 1 that's used, of course, any word can be nuanced based on context and intent and stuff like that, but that word often denotes God's authority or God's reign, which of course here makes sense. God has delegated his sovereignty, you might say, to humanity to fulfill God's task, or God's vocation, God's calling for us. But post-creation, you're right. The verbs do shift. The language does shift. It becomes it goes from A New Hope to The Empire Strikes Back very, very quickly.
Yeah. Oh man, but I've just enjoyed kind of looking at this, because one of the arguments that I've made, not to do with complementarianism or egalitarianism, but in the way of raising children in our culture, and especially millennials and younger, is there was a real shift in marriage and father and mother. I would say Gen X was kind of in that place where it kind of started, but it really hit millennials hard. It really is hitting Gen Z hard. And my problem with that, and what I've said, is I think that what's happening here is you are made to have a mother and a father, which are two sides of the image of God. And if you don't have all of that, you lack identity in some way. And so that, I think, leads to the world that we have right now, where everyone is searching for an identity, and they'll latch on to the dumbest stuff sometimes. But I do think there's a profound identity crisis in especially in America. And I think that plays a large role in it. So I'm glad you said that.
No, and I think that's right. I'm annoyed by Jordan Peterson, and then Jordan Peterson will say something that I'm like, oh, I needed to hear that, kind of thing. So I'm neutral on the Jordan Peterson thing. But
I'm kind of anti, if I'm being honest, and people don't like that. Because I've seen God, something about him just gets under my skin.
I feel like he's gotten worse as he's been captured by his audience. So it seems like we're kind of rooting this and starting in Genesis, because we have these Adam and Eve are both made in the image of God. They're both given this vocation together to rule, to be fruitful. They're both the image of God. which suggests that there really isn't a difference in hierarchy, right?
Or at least that I see established in the actual text of Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah,
right.
Most of my friends who are complementarian, who like studied this, not just grew up in it and all that sort of stuff, but have taken the time, will basically concede that, yeah, Genesis 1 and 2 doesn't teach this. We get this, we read this like we think Paul is reading this. Well, and that's not them, and that's not me saying that. That's them telling me that they think Paul's reading of 1 Timothy kind of helps them make sense of Genesis and all that sort of stuff. And that's not to say it's wrong, but it is to say that's what I'm saying, generally speaking, in the people I have conversations with.
I can see that. That makes sense. So there is a verse that kind of gets disputed, though, in Genesis, and I think Genesis 3:16, and it's part of the sort of the curse where the husband is now going to rule over the wife. Adam is going to rule over Eve. And it's part of, I think, the debate then is this God's intent, or is this a dysfunction that's wrought by the curse? Is God saying, this is how it's going to be, and this is how it should be? Or, I'm sorry, but this is the way things are going to start going now, and that's not my fault. And so that seems to be kind of one of those verses that gets debated. But nevertheless, I mean, I don't want to entirely make your case for you, but is there there's lots of verses, passages about women in these really interesting leadership roles in the New and Old Testaments. Deborah is the prophet and the judge. Judges 4, Huldah is a prophet in 2 Kings 22. You have Priscilla and Aquila in the book of Acts, who are this husband and wife team who seem to teach. And in fact, Priscilla seems to have the place of prominence. Phoebe's a deacon in Romans 16. Junia is an apostle in Romans 16 as well. Although that word probably doesn't mean like the 12 apostles, but something like a church planter, but it's still a significant role of authority, so to speak, within the church. And so we have all that, but then we sort of get into some of these verses that get a little bit more complicated. So like, 1 Corinthians 11, on the one hand, it speaks of women prophesying, which seems to go against what we read in 1 Corinthians, or at least a simple reading of 1 Corinthians 14 about women keeping silent in churches. But within Romans 11, where it talks about women prophesying, we've got God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of man, man is the head of woman, suggesting a hierarchy. And I know that word, kephale, I think, becomes debated as far as whether that means source or head, but arguably there's some kind of authority, maybe. And then you get to 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul's talking about women keeping silence in church. And, then, of course, as you mentioned, 1 Timothy talks about women should quietly receive instruction with submissiveness. Paul says he doesn't allow women to teach or exercise authority over man, but to remain quiet. And the reason he gives is that it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a wrongdoer. And so the implication that complementarians read out of that is, well, Paul is appealing to creation, like you said, right? They go, well, this is rooted in this difference between men and women that allows men to have this specific position of authority within the church, like a kind of like a teaching position, an elder, something like that, is because of creation. There's something going on here. Well, not exactly creation, but the fall. And so I guess maybe a good place to go, and Cam, if you have a different idea, you can jump in, but it would seem to me a good place to go is, I think we can agree on a lot of these passages that suggests equality and, women having these important roles, even like teaching roles, honestly, and leadership roles. We still have a couple passages that seem to suggest otherwise. Yeah. And so I guess maybe the good question to ask would be, what do you do with those passages that seem to complicate your position?
I do definitely, excuse me. I do definitely want to go over these passages. But first, if you could succinctly give your reasoning and your understanding. I mean, we talked about Genesis a little bit. Is there anything, like, what do you see and what is your argument just in its pure form? And then we can go over these specific passages. Does that sound good?
A succinct reading of the three disputed passages, like the one.
No. We'll do that. We'll do that in a minute. I want to hear your case and how you would describe your case, just in general, and then we can drill
Okay.
into the problems, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. Most of the, and by the way, interrupt me if something doesn't make sense or you want more clarification. By all means,
Okay.
I'm all good for that. So let's say what I've argued in Genesis 1 and 2, and what Walton and others have argued, Richard Hess and others have argued, that Genesis 1 and 2 holds. And then Genesis 3, you have, of course, in the previous verse, in verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and all this sort of stuff. So there's this kind of conflict that has arisen. And one of the difficult aspects about Genesis 3 is does this represent God's kind of eternal will, or is it, you might say, contingent until Christ comes, right? And so egalitarians, generally speaking, if they're consistent, will say Genesis 3 represents basically, I already used this image, but so I'll just roll with it. The Empire Strikes Back, and until Christ comes, you're living under the shadow of basically a fallen world. And of course, God didn't create a fallen world, he created a good world. And so the whole purpose of creation was to show us what God desires. And of course, Revelation speaks of all of us kind of going back to the tree, dipping our robes, and kind of having new creation, and after all evil has been annihilated and destroyed from creation, there's nothing but what creation was intended to be. And that's kind of you can hear my atonement theology kind of working through Christ recapitulates and reduplicates all of the sin, evil, and death, and kind of makes things new.
Yeah.
And the issue becomes, does Christ undo this Genesis 3 language in his incarnation? And I don't think actually the Old Testament is as sexist as people like to say. I think there's a lot of stuff in there that
huge jump in women's rights, in fact,
Oh,
compared to the
yes.
world around it. Yeah.
Contextually, yes. And so you can always see kind of the Old Testament is God. This is just the story of Jacob, or the story of Israel, God wrestling with Israel. God has what God desires, and God desired that they would go through the land, that they wouldn't be enslaved, but yet they fall into slavery, they go into exile, and so on and so forth. So I don't think God ever desired, we might say, a hierarchy based on male and female, or or slavery, or any sort of thing like that. Those are products of a fallen world that come into being when both Adam and Eve sinned, or she was deceived and fell into transgression. Adam sinned willingly because he was there with her and he ate it. And we're not given a lot of psychological reason or motivation why Adam did it. Rabbis and early theologians love to speculate, but Adam just did it. Or it's like, ooh, that almost makes it worse, if I'm honest. But point being, I read Genesis 3 to maybe Matthew 1 as basically God's working, and I don't use the word attempting or working to suggest God's not sovereign or anything. I'm not an open theist or anything like that, but God wrestling with creation to get creation back on track. And then in the incarnation, God does get creation back on track, or at least in what God desired to get going. I do see you do have a general pattern of male leadership or male rule in the Old Testament, but you see, as Cody pointed out rightly, you do see exceptions to that. Even in a patriarchal society, there's no evidence that Deborah was weird, or Miriam was weird, or Huldah was weird. It was, God raised up whom God will raise up. And if, that's kind of Gamaliel's joke in Acts 4 and 5 and 6 is, good luck if you're standing in front of God and God decides to move, to put it crudely. And so I'm willing to concede that the Old Testament has patriarchal overtones, but I don't think it represents God's ideal, even if God, the face of God, shines through that consistently and breaks the patterns of the world. That's, of course, a very big statement, just to kind of, it's a big book, the Old Testament's quite big. And then you get to the New Testament, you have, of course, the issue of, for example, women being kept out of certain places in the tabernacle, right? That was just kind of common. That was very common in ancient Near Eastern literature as well. And yet in the death of Christ, you have Paul arguing that Jesus Christ is literally the mercy seat in Romans 3:25. And I take hilasterion on there to be the actual Christ represents the mercy seat, the place where the blood of the top of the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, that can be accessed through faith. And there's no kind of, you might say, barrier to that. To go back to the idea of sacred space, Jesus now represents God enfleshed as the place in history where mercy is found. And anyone can access this faith through his faith in his blood. And so women are not kept outside of that thing, nor are slaves, nor are Gentiles. And of course, Romans is big on how do Jews and Gentiles interact. And so kind of taking atonement theology, you have I don't like the word inclusive because I think it's loaded, but you have a expansive view of atonement that does not put women and men on separate platitudes or different grounds. As N.T. Wright has said, the ground is even at the foot of the cross. The ground is even at the mercy seat. and all people have access to this God. And I'm an Arminian, so sorry if you aren't. But as an Arminian, I believe God loves everyone, desires everyone to be saved. But as a term, I'm comfortable with that. It's probably a better way of saying it. But you have an expanse view of atonement there, where anyone can access that when women previously couldn't. And you have, of course, ritual impurities that Jesus kind of played with as well. Never overturning Old Testament law, but fulfilling what it was always intended to be. Divorce. Mark 10 and Matthew 19. You have heard it said, but I say to you, hearkening back to, I'm the one who wrote the damn thing. So who are you to shake your finger at me, Pharisees? I actually wrote the book. And so you see kind of God always pulling us back to what God intended. Have you not heard from the beginning? He made them male and female. And Paul, of course, picks up on that in Galatians 3, the famous passage, in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. But I think what's more radical there is Paul's idea of sonship. You'll see translations translated as something like children of God. You are all children of God through faith. And I hate that translation. I absolutely hate it because it whitewashes what Paul's arguing. He's arguing that anyone, including the women and slaves and children who hear this, are sons of God. They have the status, the image, we might say, of Jesus Christ, of God. All are lifted up in this new exalted status in the church. Paul, of course, can't go to the Roman Empire and go, we declare sovereignty, like Michael Scott declaring bankruptcy. We declare sovereignty over all of this. No slaves ever. Good way to get killed in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And so I think what you see in all of these texts, theology of baptism, where all are baptized, when you did have some sort of issue with women impurity with that, all being baptized. The same Spirit is given to everyone for the specific distribution of gifts, Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12. And other texts. And so I think kind of taking even not just appealing to specific texts, but kind of Paul's whole theology or kind of his certain kind of axiomatic way of thinking is remarkably expansive to include women as co-participants. And of course you have female leaders. And let's take for gospel that Paul does, Phoebe, Junia, Priscilla and Aquila, Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians, Aphia in Philemon. Let's take it that you have, or Nympha, you have all these women like actually acting, and you don't have, and a lot of them actually, you don't have the men named with them. Phoebe doesn't have a man alongside her, which indicates that she's probably either single or her husband wasn't a Christian, or perhaps she was just the more prominent person in the relationship, which happens. And it's not common, but it can happen. Yeah. And so taking those, women leaders as also unless we want to dispute them, but let's just say they are what they are and move to the three passages. So those three passages kind of represent, I think two of them represent, are truly the only difficult aspects, I think, of my reading. And they're the two big ones. 1 Corinthians 11, I don't think is, for the simple reason that I don't think head there. In 1 Corinthians 11:3, God is the head of Christ and so on and so forth. I don't think head there means authority or person in authority or sovereignty. And this, not to get, we can get nerdy if we want. The word there, most often, I've done stupid amounts of reading on this, and I'm still doing stupid amounts of reading on it. The word 95, 96, 97% of the time means this thing right here.
Yeah.
And almost every single use in the New Testament means this: the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And so what you have there is a base, as I said earlier, when we talk about words having meanings, a base linguistic meaning. We all kind of share that this is a physiological idea. Right? This has some sort of basis in physiology. But Paul, in 1 Corinthians 11, is probably the first writer, maybe outside of Philo, who was a first century Jewish philosopher, who wrote contemporaneously with Jesus and with Paul, to use head in a very specifically metaphorical way.
Like visage?
Philo, I'm sorry?
Would this be like visage? Like
you could I think the best translation when it's used metaphorically, and of course, generally speaking, would be something like face, or kind of, it has a denotation of synecdoche, an aspectival representation. Like you would say the face of the head, for example, or the scalp. They didn't tear his head off, they tore his scalp off, which is part of the head, but it is not itself the head. An example would be they cut off his head, meaning he died. Or Judith, she cuts off the guy's head in the apocryphal book. She cuts off his head and he dies. And so I think the word here, I would render it something, and I would keep it as head. I would leave it untranslated just because I think it's just too easy to kind of get ideological with it. I don't know if it means source here. I think you can maybe infer that from later in the passage. But head here, I think means something like representative part.
Okay.
So one aspect there would be, and there also is an aspect of preeminence that is the most prominent part, like an extension of the person. So for example, let me pull it up real quick just to not butcher it, because bad things happen when you butcher the word of God. I think I read that in the book of Revelation somewhere. I don't want to go into eternal judgment for that one. And so yeah, what you have here, and I think that and this is going to get me in trouble too with my progressive friends. I think 1 Corinthians 11 is one of those passages that speaks a lot to kind of our modern sense of gender ideology and that sort of issue of identity, more than a lot of people might like. You have any man who prays or prophesies or something on his head shames his head. And so you have this sort of, if a woman does this, it's shameful. So cut off her hair or kind of hold your hair up or put on a veil. It's disputed what is hanging down from the head here. What Paul, I think, is getting at is 1 Corinthians 11:3 doesn't tell you a whole lot on its own. It's like, okay, this can mean many sorts of things, but you have to keep reading. So 4 and 5, you have Paul kind of eschewing a sort of shameful behavior. These sorts of things are shameful, specifically that women are doing. And so for 6, and I'm reading from the NRSV, not because I think it's the best translation, but because it's the one that popped up. For if a woman will not veil herself or have her hair in a certain way, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, you should wear a veil. So what that tells us is something about the hair is causing a problem, right? Something about the hair. And of course, you have Michael Heiser and other people kind of following a certain reading that hair here kind of refers to a testicle. It's a very interesting idiosyncratic reading from Troy Martin. It's interesting, but it's one of those readings that hasn't caught on, but is esoteric enough to be interesting. So I'm not going to, I'm just mentioning that because, we're an esoteric, I'm on an esoteric show and it's fun to talk about esoteric things. but let's go with hair. Yeah. You have hair being this sort of thing, shaving it and all that sort of stuff, which tells us that God, and if you skip to the end, just to make it a little more clear, but if a woman has long hair, is it her glory? For her hair is given to her for a covering. And if we do a little background research in the Dionysiac cult and other kind of cults and religions in the area, sexual orgies, you let your hair down and you get the freaky going in these sort of cultic rituals. Loose hair on a woman signifies sexual availability. If you look at, and this is not exhaustive, but it's generally speaking the case, if your hair is up, you're proper. If your hair is down, you're a freaky person. And it's not the same with men.
So kind of like before, I want to say it was Nancy Reagan, there were the idea that a woman would wear red lipstick would be the mark of a prostitute. So until it became so normalized that even Nancy Reagan was wearing red lipstick, it was taboo. And so I can make that connection there. One thing that I was going to say, and I think this is what you're talking about because you said dynastic. In Ephesus was where they had the Diana worship, correct?
Artemis, the worship, although that's overplayed quite a bit. There's not as much evidence as we'd like, just to be honest, about Artemis worship and all this other stuff. But Artemis is there, and Artemis is certainly in the background. But I want to be careful about not bringing too much of Artemis into the discussion. But but go with what you're saying. I want to hear what you're going with.
Right, and so that was the understanding. That's the understanding that I've read, which could be wrong. But the idea that there were these female priestesses, and that there was, and I don't know so much about in Ephesus with Diana. I have heard people claim that it was because there was the ritual sex and the ritual prostitution, but I would have thought for sure, because I know Corinth was essentially the center of Aphrodite worship, which that was, the prostitution, the temple prostitution was definitely a part of that cult. So, and I'm using the word cult in the way of the actual use of the word, which is, a worship practices essentially. So that's what I've heard, which is why, when I've read these and when I talked to Jessica about this early on, I was like, I don't think this is saying what people are saying that it's saying, but that this is a correction because of where they are. And so I think that's where you're getting to. Am I wrong?
I think you're right. I think Paul has in mind, and we still haven't gotten to what 1 Corinthians 11:3 means, because you have to kind of keep going, just because
let's do it.
A simple statement without any sort of kind of explanation. Okay, what is this, a proposition? What is this, Paul?
Right.
And then you get to the language of 7 through 9 about, for a man ought to not have his head veiled since he's the image and reflection. They translate it the glory but woman is the glory of man. And of course, there are some people that automatically kind of infer a sort of hierarchy there. But if woman is the glory of man, what does that indicate in the context of sexual immorality or sexual misconduct or the letting down of the hair that symbolizes red lipstick? Let's go with that. I think that's actually helpful. Well, it indicates that woman is man's glory, meaning woman is man's sexual counterpart. And I think creation is basically in the background of this because of representation of the Imago Dei and image language as well. Yeah. But there's also the issue in Corinth of same-sex agency and same-sex material. In 1 Corinthians 6, the man having sex with a stepmother. In 1 Corinthians 5, apparently everyone's just getting it on in Corinth. So Paul has sort of attempting to address what seems to be gender confusion, gender blurring, but also genuine sexual misconduct and malfeasance. And so Paul, being a good Jew, is looking at this going like, no, this is not how this goes. Woman is man's sexual counterpart. Woman is made to be female and is man's sexual counterpart. Man is made to be male and to be woman's sexual counterpart. He gets that very clearly in the next few verses where he says, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent or separate of man, nor man independent or separate of woman. For just as woman come from man, so man comes through woman, all things come from God. So kind of creating, you might say, that creational circle again. And the whole point is not to say that one has preeminence over the other, but the point is you are created in the image of God as male or as female. You are created to represent this sort of thing. And when you have sexual corruption that leads into where women become more, it's not even, Brienne of Tarth exists, Deborah exists. These are not, quote, feminine women, although they are very, feminine or women. But it is to say that to be a woman is to be created in the image of God and is to be a good creation. Woman is created as good. Male is created as good. And Paul has already affirmed good sexual desire between male and female in 1 Corinthians 7. Neither has authority over the other, but yields it to the other. So the man doesn't have authority over his own body, but his wife does, and vice versa. You have that kind of parallelism.
Mutual submission.
Mutual submission. And so that kind of tells us that Paul here is addressing something. I've laid out an ideal for you in 1 Corinthians 7, neither having preeminence or authority over the other's body, but something you yield to the other. And here he's basically, in the terms of prophecy, y'all have really messed this up. And so women, you are created to be women. This is good. Men, you are created to be men. This is good. And if all things come from God, then that may give us a hint of what 1 Corinthians 11:3 means, something like representative part, but also that creational component. Yeah. It's that sort of that sort of incarnational aspect of, God, Christ coming from God, coming into the world and all that sort of stuff. We see that 1 Corinthians 8. And so I think what you have here is kind of a synecdoche kind of playing off one another. You have male and female kind of representing different aspects or parts of one another. And that is indicated in how God is related to us in the incarnation through Jesus Christ. And so that's a very 30,000-foot view, and millions of more things could be said. But the only mention of authority in the passage is 1 Corinthians 11:10, which reads, as for this reason, which of course, when you see the for this reason, you look back a few verses and go, how does that work? And it doesn't make a lot of sense. But for this reason, a woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels. And it's one of those passages where you kind of go, okay. But my reading is a woman ought to have or exercise authority upon her own head, meaning have self-control. That's what I think that Greek verb or word means. It's either control or sovereignty over herself, meaning she has the capacity to act with agency in keeping her hair up and being proper. She can actually do this. And she should do it because, and this is going to sound weird, but given Michael Heiser's work, I think this is eminently plausible, because angels aren't always good in the New Testament. Angels are trying to separate us from the love of God in Romans 8:38 and 39. Yeah. And so you have some angels being bad. And so Paul seems to be intimating that some angels who aren't good are watching and don't give foot, and this is going to sound weird, don't give foot to the devil, because there are angels and all that sort of stuff going on. So it's an apocalyptic context even, I think, here. But I don't see any indication that there is an authority relationship here between male and female. I see Paul basically trying to clear up the mess between men trying to be like women and women trying to be like men, and all this sort of sexual goofiness kind of playing a part in it. At the 30,000-foot view, I'm saying, of course. Right.
Well, I mean, and the seeing head as in more or less a representative role. I mean, this is interesting to bring into the context of, I could be wrong, but this is just where my brain is, of, first, should I say 1 Corinthians or should I say
All,
first?
all my
Because it's
professors and priests are Australian or British. They say one. So
Yeah.
say I should be saying first. It's you say one Isaiah or two Isaiah. It's like no, and of course I say Isaiah because I learned it all from them.
right.
You're good.
But
I would follow the great theologian Donald Trump, and I would say 1 Corinthians.
Oh, eminent theologian Donald Trump.
But no, it's interesting, this kind of representative view of, you know, God's the head of Christ, Christ the head of man, man the head of woman. It's interesting the relationship, which they talk about as well, or Paul talks about, is, you know, that Christ died for us, and so in that mutual submission, men must be willing to die for their wives. And so I feel like this has a real line through it. Like this is logical. This makes sense to me in some way.
Well, and in that culture, men would have a sort of, I mean, they didn't have a sort of, well, or at least in Greco, there's not a whole lot, it's going to sound weird, there's not a whole lot of patriarchal stuff in Second Temple Judaism. I mean, there's some stuff where it's like, ooh, where'd that come from? But you really find it in Greco-Roman literature. Plutarch, like it's like, ooh, how did you get a wife? Oh, that's right, you probably bought her. You know, it's like, ooh, this is
wasn't one of the Greek ideas that women were essentially disfigured men?
That's straight out of Plato, which you find in Philo, which you find it in the Gospel of Thomas. Mary can only get to heaven if she becomes like a man. So it's one of those where, but if you take the representational idea, or you even accept maybe a modified source view, I don't like the word source. It doesn't, like, what does that mean? But we all know what they mean by it, or we mean by it, I guess. But that word,
it's kind of a tough passage, because whether you can plug in head and it kind of makes sense. You can plug in source and it kind of makes sense. You can plug in authority and it kind of makes sense. But it's such a strange passage that none of those entirely make sense of the passage.
You know why it's tough? You want to know why it's tough? Paul doesn't use a head-body metaphor like he does in, say, Ephesians or other texts. Mm-hmm. Here you have head disconnected from the body. Now he talks about head and body in 1 Corinthians 12 about the church and how the head can't say to the feet can't say to the hand, the feet, blah, 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 blah. He's building off that somatic. There we go. It's a somatic metaphor. Here, you don't have that. So you're kind of left going like, okay, you may have an implied somatic metaphor. Well, it wouldn't be a metaphor, it'd be biology. Man come from woman, woman comes from man. That kind of babies, you know. Women make sons, and sons make daughters, and daughters make sons, and so on and so on and so forth.
Well, you also have head as a metaphor, but hair is literal. And so it's like there's a lot going on in the passage, and it's tough to tease it all out.
Well, especially the 30,000 foot view. I've been translating Philo, and Philo uses kephale, head language, 160 times, give or take a few. And maybe I can find 2 examples where it's like, that might mean like authority, but it's used to describe an authority figure, which usually would mean something more like preeminent or prominent versus authority, you know, because, you know, the metaphor doesn't work. You can use kephale to describe a person in authority, but that doesn't mean kephale means authority. It means it's used to describe, in terms of placement, a person in authority. 99 times out of 100, it means Philo just uses it to mean this thing. And it's one of those where it's like, okay. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay, go for it.
No, you didn't. I was being rude. But no, the concept of source is interesting to me, because if you look at the Genesis 2 account, you have God who created the world and named it. I know it's not the best word, or, you know, classified it. And then you have man who classified woman. But all of creation was done through Jesus, who, so, I mean, the word. And so you've got the source thing kind of does have a sensical reality to it, in the idea of the creation and how that is spoken. And so I do see some connections in that, which is interesting. I just wanted to point that out.
No, it's kind of in terms of order, maybe a better word. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but maybe which I think in terms of sequence, the creational sequence. Because order, of course, implies all sorts of stuff, which I know you're not intending to communicate, but it's like there's a sequence to creation that kind of recapitulates back to, we'll say the Trinity in creation. You know, just go back to that. But here, I was shocked when I read. I'm like, one, I don't think this has anything to do with gender roles in a way that we like to talk about. I think it's addressing something that's far more uncomfortable, and that is gender ideology and gender identity, especially in a context that is, you did have all this, you know, the stuff we have now, that was very common back then. It was all over the place. And so it's, you know, this is nothing new. And so Paul is looking at this going like, no, 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 no. And he's affirming, I think what's radical is he's affirming the agency of women in prophecy, which both are given. He doesn't tell them not to prophesy. He just goes, don't wear lipstick when you prophesy, for lack of a better euphemism. And men, make sure, and of course, men having his hair down signified, homosexual liaisons and stuff like that, effeminacy. A lot of references to men having their hair down did have sort of a kind of effeminacy kind of thing. A lot of them were targeted with slurs and stuff like that. And that's, of course, all over ancient literature. And so if the man's having his hair down, that's signifying homosexual kind of availability. And the woman has her hair down, indicating sexual availability. Paul's basically like, don't turn the prophecy session into a brothel.
Right. Don't do the Nicolaitan thing.
Exactly. This isn't Jeffrey Epstein's Playhouse, y'all. Like this is the place of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, where he's worshipped and glorified, not where y'all get your rocks off. And so I think that's kind of how I read the passage. It tells us women and men prophesied together. It means that women did so with decorum, and hopefully, and men, of course, as well. I just don't see it as directly addressing our topic. Not that it's not probably the most difficult passage in the New Testament. As Cody said, like as many papers as have been written about 1 Corinthians 11 are interpretations of 1 Corinthians 11.
Yeah, I don't know if I entirely agree with your reading, but I have to say that I'm puzzled enough that it's hard for me to go too hard against what you're saying. But yeah, it is worth noting that 1 Corinthians 14 has a more strident statement about this than 1 Corinthians 11 does. 1 Corinthians 11 is a bit like you can get a lot, you can read something into it, you can kind of get this from it, but you wouldn't want to build a whole theology on 1 Corinthians 11. You'd want a little bit more, I think.
Yeah.
And so the question is, does 1 Corinthians 14 get us that? Specifically 34 through 35, let your women keep silence in church.
Yeah, let me throw in my presupposition here, or at least my mildly studied presupposition for 1 Corinthians 14 about women being silent in churches, which I'll just read the verse. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. What translation did you put this in, Cody? Dadgummit. Saith. And if they learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. So here are the things that I've heard. Obviously, when I was a kid, it was weird because, like I said, I grew up in kind of the charismatic movement, and so there were a lot of women speaking, but also they would never call them pastor because they felt that was wrong based on these things. And so it was kind of this weird amalgamation. But my understanding when I read into it was, one, the Aphrodite worship in Corinth. And two, I've also heard claims that it was because women, unlike men, were not taught all of the necessary things that they would need to be taught before they started teaching, essentially. And so that is kind of where my brain has landed for a minute, is kind of between these two concepts. Is that incorrect?
No, those are legitimate readings of the passage. One is, of course, the issue of the law. There's no and I went and looked, there's no Old Testament law that signifies women have to be silent. Like there's nothing there. So that creates an enormous amount of problems, because either Paul is appealing to a common law, which we go, well, why would we care about what the Roman law is?
Right.
We don't live under the Roman law. That's not to say Paul's wrong, but it's like, okay, Paul certainly got something in mind here that we don't know. Or Paul's appealing to, or perhaps a rabbinic law or rabbinic saying, which of course is like, well, no, that's not going to fly. Or he's got in mind some sort of general transcultural principle, but it's like, he doesn't get that from his scriptures, right? He doesn't get that from the law, the book of Moses, or the books of Moses. And so that leads you to kind of go, okay, there's essentially two options that I've seen here that I think work. One is incredibly complex and one is less complex. I'll go less complex first.
Okay.
One is or three technically, and two of them are less complex. One is more complex. One is the refutation device, that verses 34 and 35 represent a Corinthian slogan that Paul quotes And then verse 36 is a refutation of it. Or did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only ones it has reached? Now, Paul has been quoting the Corinthians throughout 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 7, 1 has a direct quotation, or at least probably a paraphrase of what they said, what he heard from Chloe's people, which makes sense. The problem is that it is a sort of reading that is just grammatically, at a purely Greek level, is more difficult to sustain. It doesn't mean it's implausible, but it does mean it's like, that's a little, it's not that, I don't like calling readings desperations. I think it's childish to do so, but it's one of those where, okay, that it could be, but it's probably not the best. It's not the most natural way to read it.
Well,
yeah, go ahead, Cody.
I was going to say, in addition to the grammar, usually when Paul is presenting an argument that he refutes, he goes on to refute it. And it's really, he doesn't really seem to be doing that here.
Kind of, maybe. It's Paul being non-pastoral by basically, are you stupid? And doesn't even bother refuting it. So I've heard that argument made too, which is like,
it seems a little weak.
Yeah. The other one is, and I think this has some legs, is like Paul is telling some uneducated women who are mouthing off in church to be quiet and learn. The church isn't a seminary class.
Right.
And I'm like, given what we know of women's education, given what we know of, and this, of course, Paul is having to deal with this too, the new freedom for women in Christ that we see all over his letters. And then especially we see it in the early Christian movement that women flock to this movement. I mean, it's so bad that early Christian heretics called this a religion of men, women, and children, or I'm sorry, of women, children, and slaves, because they're the only ones who became Christians, which tells us about how much they were prioritized and valued. And so it could be that sort of, this newfound freedom, I'm not under the sovereignty of the Roman Empire when I come into this home. I am valued. I have gifts. I can prophesy. I'm not under anyone's authority, but my Savior and my Lord, who has pulled me out of darkness. All these sorts of things. It's like I can see that as a legitimate, like, yeah, that makes sense to me. That you wouldn't know how to act in God's house because you've never been in God's house. And so this is Paul's way of being like, take those questions home and talk to your husbands about it. And your husbands will educate you. I think that's a very legitimate reading of the passage. So those are the two less complicated. Any pushback or insight or thoughts on that?
I mean, the second one's basically what I said. So,
well,
yeah. Go ahead, Cody.
I was going to say, I would like to just maybe add briefly. I mean, I think you and I both cited various passages in Paul, and you mentioned it just now. I mean, Paul is talking a lot about this freedom that women have in Christ. And it's kind of amazing to me that Paul is known for being such a sexist, because really you've got a couple, we'll say 4 verses or four short passages that suggests some kind of a hierarchy, or at least it could be read that way. But for the vast majority of what Paul is doing is incredibly forward thinking when it comes to the role of women and what women are doing in the churches. And so I do want to say it's not like, well, Paul doesn't have anything to say about women except for in these few verses where he seems pretty negative, which is kind of the perception that a lot of people seem to have when they're pushing against Paul. It's these passages are so difficult because there's almost always a counterpoint passage that seems to kind of be saying the opposite.
Right. Yeah.
And that is what I think makes this just so complicated. Like 1 Corinthians 11, on the one hand, like we said, well, maybe it has this passage that talks about a hierarchy, but here's this other place where it talks about women prophesying. And then 3 chapters later, he's saying women need to keep silent. How can they keep silent and prophecy in the church? So anyway, but yeah, so well, and actually the common law, just to kind of give some maybe support to that Paul is referring to Roman law there and not the Torah. As much as I want Paul to be an anti-state anarchist, like a full-fledged anti-state anarchist, he and Jesus both seem to have this major concern for the witness of Christians. Yeah. And that, it's sort of like, we're in this culture. This is kind of how they do things. Our view is actually the opposite of that, but we still have to take into consideration that, we can really freak people out and hurt our case if we go, full stop equality in this very kind of overt way. And so that does seem like it could be plausible to me as an option.
Well, it helps give some context to some of these passages, because if you start doing this, if you start freeing your slaves, what income do you have in the first century? Like you're consigning your family, your babies to death. So it's one of those, the Roman economy was built on the backs of slaves. And that's why, Paul just can't go, well, set your slaves free. It's like, well, what are the slaves going to go do? And how are you going to do all this? And you're all going to die, because you freed everyone, and then freedom leads to death. And so a lot of the difficult passages on women and slaves in the New Testament, I think, are more contingent on Paul trying to survive. Like, here's how you survive in a world that is not geared towards you at all. It's not geared toward the ethics of King Jesus. And not only do I wish Paul were, I think Paul is far more anti-imperial than we give him credit for, although he does seem to tip his hat a few times where I'm like, you had to say that, Paul. But I think Paul is caring not only about the witness, but their survival. And I think I couldn't hear you, Cam. I thought you said he doesn't want them to get killed, because last time the Jews rebelled, we saw what happened with the Maccabean revolt and all these other revolts, the revolt of Korah. They were just annihilated. And so it's one of those where it's like, there's 25 people of you in an empire of like 1 million people. Yeah, go throw your middle finger at Caesar and see how that goes for you. And so it's one of those. Go ahead.
And I was just say they did kind of throw their middle finger up at Caesar in the way with the Jesus is Lord statement, and that's definitely a part of it. But what when I said don't get killed, it's because that's my understanding and reading of the passage that everyone brings up: give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. I think that what Jesus was doing was more or less a sort of concession, but insofar as saying, pay your taxes. This is not the fight we're going to have. We have a bigger mission going on here. Let's not get killed over something temporal. So that's kind of where my brain is on that passage, which I think you can kind of see here. I don't know.
No, I get it. So I think we have to keep all that in mind when Paul talks about women and slaves and all this sort of stuff, because where's the slave going to go if you give him his freedom? And so the whole treat your slave right is itself a revolutionary concept that I think gets overlooked in a society that's like, oh boy, I wish Paul were a latte sipping, kind of, thumb their nose, Ivy League seminary professor. It's like, no, he's a first century pastor who's having to deal in a place that wants to kill him. So preaching a revolutionary message in a way that hopefully doesn't get him killed, and probably got him killed. And so we have to keep that in mind too. It's not just as easy as us living in our modern churches going, well, can women do this? Can women do that? It's like, you're not living under Caesar's realm anymore. Well, you know what I mean? You're not living under the threat of Roman death every day. We have air conditioning here. We have Amazon Prime. We're not as we actually get to vote sometimes. They didn't. And so, but to get back to the passage before I completely lose my train of thought, the more technical question is, are these passages original to 1 Corinthians 14? There was a huge debate in the past about them being an interpolation or a gloss. That is something that was inserted later into it'd be very early on into the manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 14. You see it, and you do see displacement in issues here. So there's maybe three aspects to kind of tease out real quick. I do think these are probably non-Pauline. That is, they are inserted later. But it's not something I put it in print. Looking back, I'm like, I shouldn't have put that in print. I should have been more measured with how I said that. So you learned something. One is you have a large amount of textual variance in these two verses, like words being swapped, words being misspelled, which tells us, okay, doesn't give you the whole story, but it gives you, okay, there's a lot more in two verses. There's a lot more textual variance than the surrounding verses that you would normally have. So that's just a piece. Another one is in the Western text tradition, about 500, like 5th century, these verses are transposed and moved wholesale. So they're moved as a unit down below verse 40. So they're actually moved as a unit. When you see movement, it's one thing to move a word around or flip a clause around or something. It's another thing to have blocks of text moving. Like we see that with the woman caught in adultery in John's gospel, right? Just moves all over the place. It ended up in John or Luke's gospel in a certain manuscript, like, in the 17th century or something like that. It's like someone thought it was funny just put that in Luke's gospel. And so those two things already, and they also seem intrusive to the context, which is usually a mark of something going on. And again, these aren't all, it's a cumulative case. It's not each individual argument. But there's been an article that came out in New Testament Studies by Philip Payne, and it's a really interesting article where he talks about one of our oldest Greek Bibles. And he talks about, it's like 4th century, I think, which is very early. And he found these certain markers throughout both the Septuagint and the New Testament that all correspond to well-known interpolations, insertions into the text, based on other criterion and stuff like that. And they occur in couple of places in the Septuagint where we're like, oh yeah, we can tell by Origen's work and textual criticism, that is an interpolation, that is this, we know that for sure. And same thing in the Gospels. And it also gets put in 1 Corinthians 14, and it's a break. It's a very distinct, like, paragraph-way mark, which tells us that the scribe of Vaticanus, or one of the scribes of that early Greek Bible, and its early evidence, tells us that he knew something was off with this.
Yeah.
And that's a major find, because his article, it's not without its critics. Everyone's got to criticize, and there are aspects to the article I would criticize. But the point that he made was really strongly supported by other text critics like Larry Hurtado and others who were just like, all of that sort of stuff. And so I think it is quite likely that these verses were added later into Paul's manuscript, or the manuscript that went to Corinth, and don't fit what Paul said. And that's sort of it's one of those things. I've got rows and rows of books and monographs running through my head right now. I'm trying to keep it so that y'all don't fall asleep. But that's kind of the main argument. There's also issue of certain church fathers quote throughout the passage, 1 Corinthians 14 all throughout, and talking about being quiet and listening to everyone, and then somehow skip those 2 verses. So it's one of those where it's like, wait a sec, that would be, it's not an argument from silence, it's an inference. So it's like, it'd be odd for a church father talking about being quiet, not to include something or comments about, say, the women being specifically quiet. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so those little pieces, and of course you have other scribes, later in later manuscripts, just removing it entirely, removing those 2 verses entirely, being like, nope, kind of thing. And so I think the textual tradition for these 2 verses is unstable. As I'm not going to say with 100% certainty, of course, but it's enough for me to go, these don't. I mean, you can harmonize it with 1 Corinthians 11. Most harmonization theories I've seen, I think, are just kind of, I don't really buy them. But if they are original, then I think Paul's basically going like, you have new freedom in Christ, but this isn't a seminary class. Be quiet and learn, which I think he also says in 1 Timothy 2. If original, I think just be quiet and learn. Don't be silent forever is probably the best reading. If they are original, I just think most likely, although not exclusively, they are probably later additions to the manuscript tradition. That's an opinion that's shared by, I wouldn't say a majority of text critics, but a very strong, like Gordon Fee and other people have argued very strongly for that. And so it's debated, and it'll still be debated. I know there were a few more articles that came out recently disputing Payne, but also a few that oddly affirmed some of his points. Because if he's right, then you have early attestation that the Gospels didn't have punctuation, which means Vatican, if I'm remembering this correctly, of course, is copied from a manuscript that lacked punctuation, which means Vaticanus represents a very old text, a very old way of seeing the text, which may tell us a bit about 1 Corinthians 11 or 1 Corinthians 14. But it's one of those things where I'm waiting to see more. I want to see more pushback come out on that. But that's kind of where I've landed. If I don't think they're original, but if they are, then they represent basically Paul just telling the women to be quiet. And I don't see how it represents an eternal subordination or silencing of women.
Okay. I was just going to say, if maybe partial pushback, I think you're right that there's some evidence of instability, primarily that the Western tradition does put them in a different place. My understanding, though, is that there's no manuscripts that omit those verses altogether. Is that right?
That's not a precise enough statement.
Okay.
D.A. Carson says that quite a bit. It's one of those statements where it's not true, but it's not well stated, because if you're looking at a manuscript and you know that manuscript copied from a manuscript that didn't have those verses, well then we don't have a manuscript that omits them, but we know that manuscripts did omit them, if that makes sense.
We know that there are some manuscripts that did omit them.
Yes, we don't have those physical manuscripts because we have the copy of them. So maybe a better way of saying it is, we have this book here, the Apocalyptic Paul. I'll cover this up. And there's all this stuff here. But if we look at it and we go, we scratch off the P, and it turns out there was nothing underneath. We go, that must be for, or we find a the up top here in very faded letters. Okay, that may represent an older copy of the book. Then you go inside and you say, oh, it's a draft form or something like that. We don't have the draft form. We have no copy or reference of it, nothing in the emails. But we do know that this was based on previous draft forms. And so it's a true statement in the sense that we don't currently have physical copies of them, But we know that physical copies existed because we can look at later manuscripts and say, these manuscripts give evidence that they were copied from a text or manuscript that didn't have them. And so it's too much to, it's a true statement insofar as it goes, but it doesn't actually answer, I think, the more interesting question about the text that we don't have that we know existed, because we can look at the result of those copies. So for example, manuscript 33, it's a ninth. I'm not going to speak on that because I don't have the information in front of me, and I don't want to look like an idiot. But we do have late manuscripts in the 9th and 10th century that do omit those verses, or at least transpose them very significantly. And we know they're getting it from an older text. We just don't have the older text. And so D.A. Carson and others are right insofar as we don't have a physical copy of it. But it's one of those where it's like, that's not the knockdown argument you think it is, because we're talking about a text that did exist that we just no longer have reference to. So it's like, we don't have Paul's original letter to Corinth, but we do have the copies of his letters to Corinth. And so that's just how textual stuff works. And it's more science than art, but it's a lot more art than science, and I think a lot of people like. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
To be clear, are you saying we know that there are manuscripts that don't have it because there are some manuscripts that put it somewhere else, and that's evidence that they're copying from a manuscript that didn't have it? Is that the argument?
So let's take the Western text, right? So the Western text takes those verses, those two, and moves them down below verse 40. So it just moves them down. They didn't get that from nowhere. Mm-hmm. And so the whole issue is, okay, where did the Western text go? Create it out of wholesale? Just go, oh, no, we're just going to move these two. Or because a good scribe, and we know this from Origen and others, the scriptorians and all that, they were fastidious in copying things. They were loath to remove stuff. Remove stuff. Which is why we can have great confidence, ironically enough, in the transmission of the Bible. It's very reliable because that's how these scribes worked. But if they're moving stuff around, they're not moving that because they don't have evidence to move it. And so we have to ask the question, and it's only a question because we don't have answers. Well, I think we have answers, but it's not like we have 100% certainty. Yeah. They're moving it because they think they have good evidence based on previous transmissional texts or materials to do so. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so when D.A. Carson or others say, we have no manuscripts that omit this, it's like, well, that's true, but he should say physical manuscripts that omit this, because we do know of manuscripts that move stuff or transpose stuff or at least make marginal, interpolation notes, as Payne has shown, that these scribes are getting it from something. They're getting it from a tradition or history or previous copies that we no longer have.
But they still have it, so that suggests that what they're copying from does have it, just in a different place.
If you're going from the Western text, possibly. So either the Western text, but we have to ask, why did the Western text move it?
No, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think that's suggestive, even if it's not, if it doesn't clench it. And I don't know if a lot of people follow textual criticism, but basically you have these sort of text families. So like you have this kind of tradition over here, the Western text here, whatever, and so they sort of families of text kind of look similar. They make the same kind of, they have the same kind of differences, or whatever,
or trends, yeah.
And so so like the passage about the woman found in adultery, for example, which obviously is the best passage not in the Bible, is one that we not only moves, but it's also missing in some places. Whereas these two verses that we're talking about in 1 Corinthians seem to be in the earliest text, but there's also later text traditions that put it in a different place, which suggests that there's something a little fishy going on. But I think you're right. As far as like, well, let's say we want to keep those passages. Obviously, you can't go with the strongest reading of those passages because that would contradict what Paul said 3 chapters ago, right? If women are really having to keep silent, then Paul wouldn't be saying that women are prophesying in church. Yep. And so there has to be some kind of contextual explanation for why Paul is now saying something that seems to contradict. And it seems that the safest thing is to go with the more open and free reading. And that makes this passage not as helpful for complementarians or especially the extreme complementarians, as they might think it does, because you can't really harmonize that with what Paul says elsewhere.
Yeah, and with the evidence of Vaticanus and them copying from an older text, it's just one of those things where if you're looking back and you can tell that, lacking, say, punctuation in earliest manuscripts, we know that's a very common thing in the Gospels. If Paul, or rather the scribe of Vaticanus, is copying from something that emulates very old manuscripts, that means he had very old manuscripts, or he or she, we don't know. There were women scribes, ironically. We know that this person would never change anything without good evidence. And so the fact that the Western text moves it indicates that either it could be they're like, oh, this just doesn't fit, but they're not like postmodern literary critics like we are. They're very slow to change anything. They're more likely to insert something than take something out. And the fact that they displaced them so far means that either they had good evidence to do so, or the scribe sneezed and, oh, well, I got to rewrite it and did a poor job, which actually there is some evidence that some manuscripts are like that.
Well, you could like imagine a scenario where they're saying they're reading a text that doesn't have it at all. And then they think, well, wait a second. I read a text somewhere that had this in it. And so maybe they stick it at the bottom or something, right? So you can imagine some explanation, but it's just without the physical evidence, it's a little hard to say exactly why there's a discrepancy there.
Well, you can explain that there was. You can explain the why.
Yeah.
You could just say, oh, if it's a motive to silence women, it's like, well, okay, sure, but that's a little too easy for my books. But I think contextual factors, as you mentioned, and you did have very strong literal or maybe wooden readings of scripture in the early church, which were in contradistinction to, say, Origen, who was very not literal. And so you did maybe have that issue at play. But it's one of those things where you can only speculate, but you can. I think it's a reasonable explanation to say these are copied from earlier manuscripts that either displaced them, omitted them, or there was some suspicion about them, even if we don't possess the physical copies that would give us what we'd like. But we can look at that and go, okay, for me as an egalitarian, when I was a complementarian, these were there's too much going on here I would never cite this as a text in support of my view. It's one of those where the textual tradition is too unstable, and the strongest reading literally turns Paul into just the worst type of writer. And I think Paul, at least as inspired as he is, was not a bad writer.
So let me ask, the other verse, does this kind of argument also apply to 1 Timothy 2:11-15, or is that a completely different animal?
I think it's a different animal, but you will have, I would say, I don't want to use, how do I say this nicely? More, there are some folks that go, Paul didn't write the pastoral, so who cares? Who cares what the author wrote in 1 Timothy? I have doubts about the pastorals myself, but it's at a like 70-30. I think Paul wrote them, or at least Paul had oversight over their composition, maybe is a better way of saying it. Paul probably didn't write most of his stuff. But I do, the approach would be either to say Paul didn't write these, so they're not authoritative. Who cares what whoever wrote the pastoral say? They're 2nd century, who cares, kind of things. Yeah. Or you go like me and go, no, Paul did write these, and Paul's addressing something very specific and had a very situational context that has, I would argue, universal application, but not in the eternal silence of all women everywhere. Okay. And so that's kind of how I look at the passage. I think Paul wrote them. I didn't think Paul wrote them for a while, and then I really delved into them. Like, no, I think these sound very Paul. These sound like very much like Paul. So the curious issue is that 1 Corinthians 14, some people have argued, I don't think this is as sustainable, but 1 Corinthians 14 was inserted by someone who took 1 Timothy 2 to heart and put it into 1 Corinthians 14, because there are the lexemes and the words there do match quite nicely, silence, submission, all that sort of stuff. It's an interesting theory, but that depends on you taking the pastorals very late, maybe early 2nd century, which I don't, because I think Paul died in the 1st century. And it also requires you to believe that 1 Corinthians 14 is an interpolation, and which I do accept generally, I would say most likely, but I also don't put him in the 2nd century. So,
gotcha. Oh, and just for people who don't know what the word interpolation is, just in case.
Sorry.
So interpolation is actually also used in music. So wait, my brain went blank. So an interpolation would be not like a sample, so it's not a direct taking of something, but rather being inspired by that thing and then adding it into your own song.
A later insertion into the text specifically.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that we've hit about an hour and a half. So I do want to get to a few more questions and then kind of round it out. If that's good. If you feel like you've been able to say some really good stuff.
I got a few minutes.
All right, cool. So my first question is, I asked a couple of people who, specifically one guy who is opposed to this completely. I said, do you have any questions? And so this was his question. He asked, when was the first female bishop ordained?
I have no idea. I'm not a church historian.
Yeah.
That's me being pithy. My knowledge of this debate basically extends to the early 2nd century.
Right.
In the New Testament, I'm also loath to use the word ordained because I don't think the early church had that same structure as later church structures do. Okay. Ordination is, I'm comfortable using it now to describe modern church practice, and I don't think it's ad hoc or out of nowhere. It has a very early tradition. I just don't think ordained is something the early church, or I should say the New Testament writers, being Jews, would have been like, oh yeah, that's so. I would use terms of maybe commissioned or sent, or kind of, I would try to use more New Testament language than ordained. Ordained in the New Testament, of course, is something God tends to do, and that's ordaining events or plans or structures or something like that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if I were to expand on what I think he's going with the question is that he's assuming that there's at least one sort of role within the church that women have never performed, at least until recent times, which suggests kind of a continuity. Not just with the New Testament, but you could maybe argue even the apostles and the Old Testament priests. I will say, I was just reading through a book called The African Christian Mothers and Fathers, and there's a chapter on African Christian mothers or women who are influential in the African church, and they reference a book by either Torgeson or Torhason called "When Women Were Priests," and they make an argument that there is some evidence of women in Cappadocia and Bithynia functioning as presbyters or priests, but I don't actually know what the case that's being made for that is. So they're
probably based. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's possible that there may be some, but it is elusive. We'll just say. Yeah.
Well, okay. So you could make the case. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to let you know when I was talking to him, he clarified, that the first one was the late 20th century, and of course, since this is a group chat with none of us are the same denomination, it was fun. But he had said it really took that long before Christians realized it was an okay thing to do, when all along it was the biblical model. And then follow up, another guy came in and said, to be clear, I don't care if it's a bishop. I just want to know when the first woman was treated as having teaching authority over men. Maybe that's a way to ask the question with a little less specific to certain denominations.
Well, I mean, you have women teachers all over. You have, Priscilla and Aquila. I mean, took Apollos aside, her being more prominent, as Cody said, and taught him more accurately the ways of the Lord. So there's that. There's also, and it's one of those things where every one of you in Colossians 3:16, when you come together, has all sorts of things, but also has a teaching. So given that Paul mentions women submit to your husbands 2 verses later, I don't think he has women not in mind when they come together. Now, of course, I think Paul had specific reasons for telling wives to submit to husbands, but he does say a few verses before that every one of you, when you come together and gather, has a teaching, very specifically a teaching. So I don't think that excludes women, for the reason that women are literally mentioned 2 verses later, even though they are told to submit to their husbands, which I'm perfectly fine with, because I think Paul had a very specific reason for that. There was something also, Cody, that you mentioned. And this is stuff that is coming out now. Thank God for excavation and archaeology, where you do have what seem to be very interesting, cave paintings isn't the right word, wall art, the ancient wall art, where women are depicted in certain poses that do signify some, I don't know, the finger thing. You see that? Paul, there we go. They have certain, it's a certain gesture they have, that priests or Paul will have, and women are doing that too. And there's one very famous one where the woman has her hand up like that and it's chiseled off. So someone was not happy about that. And so it's one of those where, not being an archaeologist, I couldn't quite, I'd have to pivot to them. I think Cody said, I would use the word, there are suggestions that I think there's suggestive elements there. Is it as clear as I would like in the 3rd or 4th or 5th century? No, but unfortunately, I'm happy to admit my lack of knowledge on what happened in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, outside of a few things here and there.
Gotcha.
I think the New Testament does present women in positions of authority, specifically with certain titles, and working alongside Paul without any sort of, by the way, they did this, whereas Paul did this. There seems to be a shared ministry that they all kind of engaged in without reference to hierarchical ordering. And the few passages or the one passage that does seem to suggest it, we didn't talk about, but people can email me and talk about that, the 1 Timothy 2 passage, and all that sort of stuff. But that'd be my very short answer.
Okay.
Well, very short, very long answer. Attempt at an answer.
Well, so as you know, anytime people who are interested in theology or theologians get together, there's this fight for precision. And so I just want to give these other points just to you to see if they matter to you. He said, I don't care if it's a bishop, or I care, but you probably won't. He says, I say presbyter, the Greek word, to get around disagreements about what that amounts to in English terms. So he's asking, can you point to a presbyter at any point in time in history? But you said you're not a historian, so
I should say I'm not a church historian.
Right.
So it's unfortunately my knowledge is limited to the first and a little bit of the second century. I know I could recommend a few people to you, but unfortunately I don't have their material in front of me.
Gotcha. All right. And the final thing from this chat was, he said, my worry is that if you ask about women with authority, he'll be vague and appeal to examples in the New Testament that may or may not involve authority, but where that's not stated at all. Example, Priscilla and Aquila. There's an important distinction between I found that authoritative and this person is ordained in the church.
Again, I'm going to have to go back to I don't think that assumes a denominational kind of, like you and I've talked about earlier,
right.
Words having very specific meanings to very specific denominations.
Right.
I should of course joke, as an ordained Baptist, I think Baptists shouldn't be ordained. It seems very anti-ecclesiology given what we believe, but I think there's something to this. So when you say titles applied to men, and this might reveal some of our bias, and I had this bias, so I'm speaking with, flicking myself with this. Oh, we don't bat an eye if Paul calls himself an apostle. But for some reason, when Junia is mentioned as an apostle, we go, oh, well, we have to find something here. And I did that for months with Junia. Junia pissed me off as a complementarian. But she is called an apostle, and there are a few people that dispute that based on grammar. But I think it's a really bad argument.
Well, doesn't the word apostle essentially just mean those sent out?
If you take it woodenly, yes. Apostle can have a sent one, but it can also have in combination with being sent, it has a titular kind of. I mean, I don't think a lot of these titles carry the same formal authority that we have in the church today. We tend to formalize everything. I don't think it was as simple as that in the New Testament. But when Paul calls himself an apostle to the Gentiles, we understand what he means in Romans 1. When he says Junia and Andronicus, and Andronicus gets left out of the conversation. Everyone argues about Junia. No one talks about how good Andronicus was as an apostle, but they are prominent among the apostles. That is, when you take that preposition and you look at how it's used literally throughout all of Romans 16, it means in terms of location, within a select group, in the Lord, you are a Christian, that sort of thing. And so they are prominent among those who are apostles. And there's one or two articles that have come out disputing that, but most complementarians I've talked to don't accept the reading. It seems to be in the majority report across the board is that the only dispute is taking sent one as missionary and kind of leaving out the formal or the titular aspect of apostle.
Gotcha.
Douglas Moo does that, Tom Schreiner does that, and they essentially admit and elsewhere that because of their view of a certain passage, this is better read this way. And I'm like, that's fine. I appreciate you just saying it like that. Some people don't say that. But gotcha. Apostle is something Paul designates to himself. And if we only had Romans, we would know what an apostle is. It's Paul. And he calls Andronicus and Junia apostles. There's no other reason for us to then go, oh, but over here, the early church didn't have, the Roman church didn't go, oh, well, apostle, that means in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, that means this. Or Philippians, it means this. They just had the word apostle. And Paul calling himself an apostle in Romans gives us a very clear example. It's someone who is sent on a mission from God with authority to preach to the Gentiles for conversion. And Andronicus and Junia, perhaps a couple, we don't know. Some people speculate, we don't know if they're married or not. It's weird that they'd be paired but not. But early Christians were also notorious for men and women going together and doing things without being married, even though there's no sex involved, which I think is very interesting. It tells us about how we view things now. But I think there's very little evidence to suggest that they weren't apostles, in the sense of maybe not the 12, because last I checked, their names aren't Peter. But certainly you would probably place them among the 72 that get sent out, or the 500 that got sent out in 1 Corinthians 15. But Richard Bauckham has a really interesting hypothesis, and Ben Witherington has backed him up on this. And it's that Joanna and Junia are equivalent names in Latin and in Greek. And it is very common in the ancient world for someone to have, you might say, a Jewish name and a Greco-Roman or a Latin name.
Dorcas, Tabitha.
Saul, Paul.
Yep. Paul, Saul. Paul didn't become Paul when he became a Christian, or Saul didn't become Paul when he became a Christian. Whenever he talks about himself, it's always Paul, because he's writing to Gentiles. And so Ben Witherington and Richard Bauckham make that point. And I think it's very strong. And if that's the case, then you have Joanna, who was with Jesus in Luke chapter 8 and in Luke chapter 4. She was at the resurrection before Paul was, which is why Paul can say they were in Christ before me in Romans 16. And they are, of course, his kinsmen, his fellow Jews, which I think is it's one of those where if that's the case, then that gives us the historical Jesus has roots in the Roman church very early on, that Jesus movement soared out, which tells us that if we just want to talk about missionaries, we are missing the point, because we're talking about someone who sat at Jesus's feet, who bankrolled his ministry and witnessed his resurrection before all the guys did, because they were at the tomb before Peter and all of them. It's one of those arguments I think is very interesting, and I think it's starting to really catch on, because it makes sense of all the textual data, and it creates a strand between epistles and the life of Jesus. And we're always looking for stuff to, how do we bring Jesus and Paul together? Are they so separate? It's like, well, yes, the same people that knew Jesus, Paul knows them too. And so that means anyway, Cody, I can tell you want to say something. Go for it. I'll stop.
Sure. I was going to say, if I'm not mistaken, the term apostles also apply to Timothy and Barnabas, and it's at the very least not clear that Barnabas is an original witness. I don't think that Timothy is. Timothy's seems to be picked up along the way.
He learned from his grandmother and Eunice, and so he's a baby apostle.
Yeah. So and I think that suggests that there could be. We may want to differentiate between apostle in one sense and then in another sense, and not maybe blur the lines too much. But
you have I would say you have the 12, and then you have kind of the early Christian strata, maybe is a better way of saying it, the early Christian movement. And you also have apostles not being mentioned, or being mentioned alongside prophets in 1 Corinthians 12, I think it is. Apostles and prophets and all these sorts of things too. So apostle was a live term in the first century that I think ceased in some sense, although I'm loath to say anything ceased in the first century, because Jesus is still alive. But at the very least, we can say this is a very formal understanding of a word that is applied not indiscriminately to people. And it seems to be applied very specifically to someone who is either a witness to the resurrection of Jesus, or is in that line of witness to Jesus. And that would explain maybe Eunice and Lois and Timothy, perhaps. I know there's been some debate about Eunice and Lois in the pastorals about how far back they go. We just don't have a lot of evidence for that. I think taking apostle in its kind of base sense, Andronicus and Junia are equivalent to Paul, and whatever Paul is, they are. And I think that's fair, given how Paul uses apostles in Romans, that word group. To go any less than that, I think at that point, ideologies run the gamut. I'm not saying they're more than Paul, although Paul seems to suggest they were in Christ before him and they were in prison with him and all this sort of stuff. I'm just saying whatever Paul is, they are. And I think that's a very fair assessment of the actual evidence. And especially if she's Junia, then you have that direct line between Romans 16 and Luke's gospel, which makes sense given Luke and Paul's relationship with Luke Acts and the pastorals and the authorship there. So that might be another additional strand. But I can tell you want to say something, please.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when the idea of apostle as church planter seems to have some weight to it, particularly when you think about, what these people like Paul and Barnabas are doing. They're on this sort of mission to go to these new places and start churches. But it's also, I think, kind of hard to say that that's not sort of a position of authority, right? If Junia is going out and saying, here's the gospel, I'm going to explain it to you, let's start a church, that feels like a teaching position, right?
I think so.
And so I think for me, as someone who's a little bit of a fence sitter on this issue, I see all this evidence for egalitarianism that seems pretty strong. And the only kind of issues that I sort of have is that, well, it seems like maybe there's this like kind of one office that maybe isn't extended to women. And so that becomes, I think that the person you were speaking with, Cam, who made that point, I mean, I think that's a fair point, and it's a question worth asking. But at the end of the day, you still have women in these what you would kind of consider authoritative positions, even if they aren't given a certain office, maybe. And I think it is worth noting, we, a lot of times as Christians, we sort of think as Paul as like, well, they made a mistake when Judas died and they gave apostleship to Matthias because it should have been Paul. Paul was the guy that God picked, but Paul was not a witness of Jesus in, at least his earthly ministry.
The historical Jesus, we might say.
Yeah. And so, I think that you've got a pretty good point that is authoritative as we want to make Paul. And I do think he's authoritative. I think maybe you could say in Galatians, he's arguing for some kind of a special ministry and knowledge that maybe gives him more weight or consideration. I think you're right that he's basically putting himself in this position, not with the original 12 in a way, but like with the Junias and the Timothys and the Barnabases. So those are all, I think, really important points to consider in this, because I think it's kind of like, I think of like the word inerrancy, and I like the word. And on some I don't actually like the word. I kind of like when people ask me if I believe in inerrancy, I say, well, sort of, and they'll say, well, what do you think is Chicago's statement of inerrancy? And I'll say, well, I think I agree with it, but they have qualified the word so much that it doesn't really sound like what you think inerrancy means when you first
like
hear
hell.
Yeah. And I think it's I sort of feel sort of similarly about this issue, where like complementarians will make an argument and I'll go, well, that sounds kind of reasonable and biblical. But it's like the devil's in the details. Once you start really looking at what's happening in the church, are women on a level playing field with men? Are women teaching? Are women doing this? Are they being sent? Are they apostles? Are they church planners? It's like, well, yeah. And so, what's really the difference? What are we talking about? Because to just say, well, they don't have this one office. It's like, okay, what's the significance of that? And I think it's that's where I think that's what puts me sort of in the middle on this. Because it seems like there's a difference, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is when you have all this evidence that there's no difference.
Well, it's kind of like the case for conditionalism. I viewed complementarianism and the case for eternal atonement very similarly. There's one or two passages and maybe one line of argument, maybe church history, where I'm like, yeah, eternal atonement is by far the majority report through church history. Happy to concede that. It has the weight of, I don't want to give y'all Matthew 25, but let's say I'll give you Revelation. I'll give you Revelation, at least those two passages in Revelation. But I'm not a believer in eternal atonement because of those three aspects. I'm a believer in eternal atonement or annihilationism. I was a universalist. That was a fun time in my life, but no longer. All good things come to an end, ironically enough. But
was that when you didn't accept the authority of the pastorals? Because that would make sense to me.
No. The pastorals were very helpful for my universalism. No. But it's one of those where I'm like, okay, I've got this mountain of data here. I've got, I would argue, the original aspect of creation. I've got all this stuff here. I've got a certain line of argument here, which is weighty. Church history is not something to be thrown off. And hopefully I didn't do that. I was just saying I'm not as qualified as I'd like to speak on that.
Right.
I know my limits. And you've got two very intense passages in Revelation. That should give you pause. You shouldn't just go, oh, this is easy. But it should make us go, okay, am I treating this issue in terms of weight and evidence fairly? And I'm not saying I'm throwing that at you, Cody. I'm throwing that at myself because I'm just speaking of myself here. It's like, okay, am I treating the evidence in the way that I would treat any other issue? It's like, I'm not a cessationist because of 1 Corinthians 13. I don't, I think the wealth of evidence supports continuationism. Having a troubling passage is troubling, but it doesn't mean it's just like, well, I'll have to wrestle with this until either it fits the data or I just live in the tension of being as humble as I can and learning as much as I can and not settling for, an easy understanding. Because I was an egalitarian for a year and I still didn't know what to do with Ephesians 5, and I'm sitting there going like, this has to somehow fit. because all this other stuff seems to say this. And granting me that all this other stuff does say that, just for the sake of argument, all this other stuff says that. I don't know what to do with this. And then I did more research. I did more stuff on word studies and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, oh, this tweak, oh, there it is. Boom, done. Which is why I think there needs to be a lot of humbleness and a willingness not to change your mind too quickly. Cody, you know all about that as well as I do. And Cam, I'm sure you do too. Changing your mind very quickly is not a smart thing to do. You should be disturbed enough to change your mind very, very slowly.
Yeah, that's how it worked with conditionalism for me.
I'm preaching, so please.
But that's how it worked with conditionalism for me, because I had no need to change my view of hell. I had completely justified it in my mind, and I didn't change overnight. I read and I read. I will say there was probably I don't even know, between a 5 and 7 year period where I thought of it, and I was like, I'm in the middle. I don't know what to say. And I was like, but I lean this way, So I definitely agree with that. I have, and it's funny, is you keep saying things and I'm like, I really want to ask about this and I want to talk about that. And I'm like, we just don't have time for me to ask all my questions. But I do think, you being a past universalist, we should probably have that conversation
100%
later
happy
on.
to do it. My PhD is on the subject, so it'd be a good time.
Well, and especially since I've never heard a good argument for universalism. Like, never. Every time anyone's ever brought it up, it's been a very poor argument.
A good biblical argument?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I can imagine a lot of like good theological arguments, but yeah, it's a little tougher to.
Right.
I'll give you one right now. I'll give you a 10-second one.
Okay.
Reformed theology, down to the bone, universal atonement.
Yeah. Oh no. Of course, if you're within that framework, absolutely.
Yeah. If you're Reformed, universalism is very, bar all of them. It is very easy to affirm universalism if you're a Calvinist, because you are very close to it. I'm not saying all Calvinists are anything like that. It is, under a Wesleyan or Arminian paradigm, it's human free will, it's participation, it's faith, it's all this sort of stuff. Salvation is in some sense contingent on human freedom. It's possible universalism could be true, but in Calvinism, if you take unconditional election, irresistible grace, total depravity, unlimited atonement, and the saving act of Jesus Christ and perseverance of the saints, that is a very strong theological and biblical argument. It's just, I'm not a Calvinist, and I don't accept a lot of the paradigms and all that sort of stuff.
Well, and that's something I've said. I said, that's my problem with the argument for universalism, is it's every time I've heard it, and why I say it's not a great argument, because I don't think Calvinism is particularly, it's a strong argument, but I don't think it's like, I cannot justify it.
It's a perfectly rational, reasonable view that I think is wrong. Just like I think other views are Christian views that are held by wonderful people that I just think are wrong. And I'll see them in heaven probably before I get there. I'll probably have to go through the gates a little slower.
But I've said these are the opposite sides of the coin, because, a universalist in some way, because a lot of the argument that I hear, and I'll stop after this just because we'll go too long. And my friend Brad, who I do the propaganda report, is waiting for me to do an episode of that after this. I don't know why Calvinists aren't universalists, because when I look into that, and the argument that universalists make that I've heard the most is God always gets what he wants. He is sovereign.
Yep.
What he wants, he gets. And that's the same base as Calvinism. And so the same sovereignty model, which I think is, I disagree with that sovereignty model. I do like the kind of ship, I forget what it's called. The ship sovereignty model makes sense to me. But if God gets what he wants, then, and the framework of Calvinism is there, then that means everyone is saved eventually.
Yep. Or
and
at least
so that,
if you take those two tracks and make a train out of it, there you go.
Right. And the opposite is true as well. That's why I don't think it's fully coherent, is because either way
it's coherent in the way that, and this, I'm not throwing Calvinists under the bus, so forgive me, Chris, and all them. It is coherent if you accept a certain bit of data. And I'm not talking about a little bit. I'm talking about if you have a circle and you put all our stuff, it's easy to have a great systematic when you got a circle that you can kind of put stuff in. And I'm guilty of this too. I'm not throwing anyone on them. But if you have Calvinism and you got that a little bit more expansive, and you have universalism. And it's one of those where it's like under a certain paradigm or hermeneutical kind of or theological method, it totally like you just got to make these other pieces fit. And for me, reading Second Temple Judaism was one of the things that made me go, oh boy, they are not universalists. And if Paul's a universalist, he's the only one that's got this, because you don't find this in Jesus. I mean, you find it in John, perhaps, some elements of John. But it's like you don't find this in this historical Jesus. You don't find this in the early Christian proclamation. You certainly don't find it in Hebrews. And so it's one of those where I was like, well, either they missed the boat on this, or Paul's the only one who came up with this. And of course, there's debates about that, but given that, I think, well, anyway, there's way to go, but I don't want to take it more of your time.
Cody, before I ask the big question and wrap up, is there anything else you want to hit?
Yeah. Nick, if your position is correct, then why did God in his providence arrange for you to show up an hour late? No, I'm just kidding. So what I would say
I think
is
you should ask Cam that question.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So I kind of fall like in between sort of a soft egalitarianism and soft complementarianism, and I used to be more strongly in the complementarian camp, but I've always taken seriously the biblical commands to love my wife, put her interests before mine, and so that's in the marriage context. But also you can look at what leaders in the church are called to do, which is this sort of servant leadership, but maybe looking at just the marriage example, like in my marriage, we've always worked together to come up with mutually satisfactory solutions to conflicts. And so while I've had some like complementarian leanings, it's hard for me to point to how it's impacted power dynamics in my marriage. And I guess maybe my question, like a final question, is what do you see as the practical impacts of taking either of these views, both in the church and the home? Because for me, I feel like a lot of people could look at my marriage and say, oh, well, he must be an egalitarian, but I'm not quite in that camp. And I think similarly, if a church looks very authoritarian, it's not being very biblical. So then at what point are we talking about what does authority mean?
I think that's a really good question. And my 30-second, 30,000-foot answer, and this could be its own podcast. So, give me grace, chat, for not saying everything that I could say. I think we have a very flawed notion of what power looks like, just generally speaking. The New Testament envisions power as Christ taking the form of a slave, emptying himself, or I should say humiliating himself, and taking the form of a slave, and being born in human likeness, sharing in the human condition fully. When power, and this is a problem issue, of course, we see in politics, everything is conceived of in terms of power. And there's nothing wrong with at least being aware of dynamics. Like I get that 100%. But we don't have a Christocentric model of marriage. We have a power-based model of marriage, and it becomes about who has control of the power gun to force the other to do what you want to do. And the New Testament does not envision that sort of model. The 1 Corinthians 7 model is you don't even have authority over your own body because your wife or your husband does, which tells us a bit about sexual dynamics. It tells us that do not deprive one another except by mutual assent and prayer, which tells us that wives and husbands have spiritual authority in their lives. That is something they share. But also it tells us that sexual desire is good. And this is one of the rare things in the ancient world, Paul is affirming there that women have sexual desire and it's good. He's treating them as sexual agents. But he also says this is to be done together. This is to be done in yielding to one another, not using your body for your own pleasure, but looking to the needs of your spouse. And I think if we integrate a 1 Corinthians 7 and Ephesians 5, for example, and I actually tried this in my book, I don't think I was successful in it. Those passages are fixed on sanctification, on holiness, on making the other into the image of Christ. That's not something the husband does for his wife. It's something the wife and the husband do together for the sake of one another and for their kids if you have kids. If one of the parents is a Christian, then the whole batch is holy, is kind of the joke that Paul tells in 1 Corinthians 7. Wife, do you think you might save your unbelieving husband? And husband, you may save your unbelieving wife. But if they consent to be with one another, if there is mutual accountability, there's mutual emptying, there's mutual deference. If everyone's thinking about who's got the power gun, you don't have a marriage, you have a subverted contract where you occasionally screw each other. It's like, it's not, and I think for an egalitarian model, I would say, for me, an egalitarian model does not look at power as the thing that you have. It's the thing that you give up for the sake of the other. And if you're looking at Jesus as your model, you're both told to imitate him. In Philippians 2, have the same mindset. That's not for men. That's not for women. That's for the whole church. So even just including the whole church and having the same mindset of Christ, who didn't use what he had for himself, but gave everything up for the sake of the church. And so I think it tells husbands that there's a demand of you. Whatever you conceive of, let's say an egalitarian, if you believe you're the head of the household, then you give up your headship for the sake of your wife. And wives, you are to love your husband as Christ has loved the church, and to empty yourself for him. And you do that together. And so the egalitarian model of marriage doesn't deny differences. It essentially asserts what God has called you to be in marriage, as a man, as a woman, is for your good. And that doesn't include hierarchy, although it may include hierarchy in certain aspects. For example, he does the finances. She watches the kids. And as long as there's harmony in that understanding, that's completely fine. If he wants to be a stay-at-home dad and he feels called to do that, and she works outside the home, fine. But there is an assent, there's a mutual empowering to that goes for the sake of the other. And I think churches and marriages become toxic, and I'm not limiting myself to complementarian marriages or churches. I'm speaking more principally. I see this more principally in complementarian marriages and churches, but not exclusively so. So we all know Willow Creek. I'm not giving egalitarians a pass on this.
Yeah.
You have no idea how angry and I cried like a little girl, like not like when I read that story, like about Bill Hybels and all that. Like that was enough. I'm like, ooh. Anyway, if your marriage is built on who has power, you will inevitably have a marriage and a church that is based on who has the power gun and how that gets used. And God help you if you have a madman wielding the gun of power. In an egalitarian model, the question is not on who has the power gun, it's who empties themselves for the sake of the other. And I think, Cody, you're right. It's you give up for the sake of other. 30 seconds. Yep, that's how we do things. 30 seconds. Never give a pastor or a former pastor 30 seconds. That turns into 3 points and 45 minutes later. So hopefully that begins to answer your question, Cody.
Yeah. I think that one of the things we need to remember, and it's why even though the oneness Pentecostals would call my beard and tattoos, anathema, I do want to get a tattoo of the slain lamb in Revelation 5, because when you see this image, when you see this vision, or read it rather, John talks about how there's the scroll with 7 seals that cannot be opened by anyone. No one has come forth. And then the angel in John gets really sad about this. And an angel says, no, but look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah is here to open the scroll. He has been deemed worthy. And when he looks, he does not see a lion. He does not see the traditional image of power, which is based in violence. Rather, he sees a really weird looking slain lamb, showing that the true power that we have, the true power that Christ had, was in his sacrificial death and his absolute giving of himself wholly to us and to the world, for the world. And so if we're not viewing our marriage, or if we're not viewing our church in this same way, we are drastically missing the point, in my opinion. So I have 2 last questions for you.
Make them quick. I can tell my wife is trying to keep the kiddo from tearing her head off right now.
No, I'm with you. Last 2 questions, and just as quickly as possible. My first question is, I named the episode of this show in order to make it provocative, which was Women Know Your Place. So, as shortly as you can, succinctly, what is women's place?
Wherever God has called them to be. Kitchen, pulpit, presidency, wherever you're called to be.
Okay. And then my final question is the big question that we ask at the end of every show that we do. This show used to be a political show. We used to do libertarian nonsense. And I got real tired of it. And God called me out. Like, he straight up called me out. Because I felt when I was younger that I was called to communicate truth. And that was like the big calling on my life. And so I don't know why I'm going into this, but let me go into it. I was sitting at my wife's grandmother's house, and God just slapped me sideways.
That's always fun.
Because I had tweeted out kind of in a way because I was annoyed with someone else. seek ye first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. And there was a couple of different things that I kind of learned from this moment, but seek ye first the kingdom of God. And so God was kind of slapping me and going, you have this gift and this calling in your life, and instead you are preaching nonsense. You're preaching things that don't matter. And I was like, oh, damn. And so that was a big shift. But when we swapped it over from the political model to this kind of wide-ranging but also very Christian model, we did it right in the middle of the pandemic. So there were a lot of people that had lost family members, that had lost their jobs, that had fallen back into addictions or whatever. A lot of really desperate, despairing people. And I am a firm believer in hope. I believe in the resurrection. That's what's happening at the end. I have a lot of hope in that. But what we decided is that me and Jessica was that this was a show of hope. And so we wanted to share hope with our audience. So here's the question. Regardless of scale, global, national, local, whatever, personal, what is something right now that gives you the hope and motivation to carry on doing the good work? What makes you not a nihilist and a cynic?
Okay, so this is going to be a little serendipitous. I've been really struggling with depression. I have my whole life. I've had a truly terrible year. It has been, I don't know if I can cuss. It has been the worst year I think I've ever had. And this is the year where this is the second year my son was born. So he's 2. He was born at the beginning of the pandemic, which tells you in the midst of all that, how bad the year's been. Essentially lost my job in ministry. Won't get into that, but had to move, had nothing basically, still don't. Working a part-time job, trying to find ministry, trying to be faithful. It has been a truly awful year. And I was actually asking God that question over the past week, like, am I actually called to this ministry thing? Am I actually, like, should I even be involved in any of this? And I used words I normally don't use, but I used. Am I supposed to be doing any of this? And I haven't heard anything, mostly because I don't think God speaks to me usually. I'm always kind of left to listen to other people, which is why this is a little fortuitous.
Yeah.
What gives me hope? One thing that I think I have to keep coming back to is the very nature of what God did for us and how I see that in the life of my 2-year-old son. Born at the beginning of the pandemic, he was not out for about 2 minutes, and they had to whisk him away from us and take him to the NICU because he had swallowed a bunch of stuff and was having a tough time breathing.
Yeah.
Not to mention you got the global pandemic and the sky is falling outside. And looking back on that God can somehow, in God's way, in a way that I will never understand until I'm at the other side of eternity, and even then I don't know, take the bull crap that we do and just somehow bring a diamond out of that.
Yeah.
Is something that I'll never understand. But then again, that's the heart of resurrection. It was dead and gone, and yet the line of the tribe of Judah is alive.
Yeah.
And so for me, seeing my 2-year-old son run around healthy. Well, he's not healthy now. He's got a snotty nose and stuff. Seeing my 2-year-old little boy run around, rambunctious, full of energy, vivified by life. Seeing my wife begin to fulfill a calling that she has to teach in ministry and seminary and stuff like that. Being comfortable knowing that maybe God is at work in other people's lives and I'm along for their ride now. I don't know if it gives me hope, but it gives me a longing to see where God might take me. Yeah. And that's perhaps a little vague for y'all. If I get any more specific, I might cry. I'm not much of a crier, but it's been that kind of year where I just might.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that gives me hope, and that was not quick, but given how life has gone and the question you asked, given what I've been going through today, especially, I'm like, that deserves more than 30 seconds.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That one it can always take as long as it needs to. And what's fun about that is the question comes with so many different answers. One of my favorites was Kate Sherrill, the girl we talked to last year about death, was just like, my puppy. And it can go from puppy to the resurrection and in the end. Like it's that wide and that and that's what I like to do. I like to hold on to these little moments because, you know, I've dealt with anxiety, I've dealt with depression, I've dealt with different things, but it's like, if I take a look at any one of my kids, but especially always my youngest and my girl who's right above her, it's worth every bit of pain I've been through. When I look at my wife, same thing. My boys, everything I've been through has been worth it. And it only gets better at the end. So,
yes, because hopefully in heaven there's Rittenhouse 100 bottled in bond.
I'm saying, I haven't had Rittenhouse.
The whiskey that shoots back, if you catch the joke.
I have not had that. Oh, Rittenhouse.
There we go. Political joke. I'm great. There we go. Is that for $20, $21? At least here in Cali, it's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm the daily drinker, which I don't drink every day. It's just the best way to describe it is Buffalo Trace for me.
I'm good with Buffalo, but Rittenhouse has an extra bit of spice and an extra bit of smoothness for me that Buffalo doesn't. But if you put Buffalo in it was my everyday, I'd be very happy with Buffalo.
Yeah, Bullet has a nice little rye head on it that I like as seconds. Well. Sorry. Okay.
No, you're good. I'm imagining chat's like 30 seconds. Damn.
I love bourbon. Okay, so to finish up, I'm just going to tell people where to find you. You add anything you want to, and then I'll let you go off the screen. Usually I'm like, hey, if you want to hang around and talk, we can do that, but I have plans, so I can't this time. But if anyone wants to, well, first, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing this little bit of your story. Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to talk about the universalism thing because that fascinates me. But if anyone wants to find you, you have a YouTube New Testament Theologist, which you can search that. I didn't see a specialized link. I don't know if you have one, but
I can send it to you.
Okay. So yeah, New Testament Theologist, you can search for that at this point. But you also have a Twitter at Nick Quient. That's at NickQuient. All right. And is there anything else you want to add to that? Anything else you want people to know about you?
No, that's about it. Yeah.
Well,
no, just thank you for having me on. And Cody, it's always a blessing and a blast. If you ever want me to come back on and wax eloquent about bourbon or scotch or New Testament stuff, I'm happy to do it.
I'm all about it. Well, I really do appreciate you very much. And I'll be praying for you and your family in this moment because I know I'm in not an extremely similar circumstance, but I'm in it right now. So yeah. I fully understand. So thank you so much. I'll let you go. It was good. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. God bless.
You too. All right. So for the rest of you, let's roll on out. For me, let's talk about what's coming up because that's always the most exciting thing for me. We're booked through September. I've got to start looking into my spooky season for October. I've got a couple of leads out there for that. I also have the first week of November planned now because of what happened with him being late. It's kind of funny. But next week we're having Josh Hires on the show. When I say we, I mean me. This one will just be me and Josh. I won't have a co-host sub in or anything like that. Did I freeze?
I see you.
Okay, cool.
I hear you, but you're doing this. So I think you...
Yeah, I froze. Okay, so don't worry about that. If you can hear me, that's fine. So next week, we're going to have Josh Hires on. Josh was a worship leader at the college that I went to, and he he traveled, and he was someone that I really looked up to. And I'm excited to catch up with him. He had a lot of stuff happen in his life since. And so we're going to catch up. I'm going to talk about a project that I want to work on. There's going to be a lot of cool stuff with that. Right after that, we're going to have David Gornosky back on to talk about mimetic theory and get deeper into that. Right after that, we're going to have Mr. Elias Dummer back on, the musician that we spoke to previously. And we're going to talk about the charismatic renewal. And because he grew up in Toronto at the Toronto Blessing in kind of an Anglican area, and I'm very curious about his viewpoint. So we're gonna talk about that a little bit, and then finally, I finally found someone who can do it. There's so much Torah observance and Judaizing going on the TikTok app right now. It's wild. And so I wanted to speak to someone who had been in the Torah observant movement and left to go back to regular Christianity, right? And so I finally found someone, and she also happens to have been a witch in the past. So it's going to be a really cool conversation. Her name is Kat.
So she was Torah observant and was also a witch?
She was a witch before the Torah observance.
Yeah, but then she became Torah observant and said, "Oh yes, let's burn the witches." As I
right, it's really weird.
Yeah, okay.
I think it'll be super interesting.
Right, fair enough.
And so if you want to follow Cody, I forgot to write these things down. So you tell them where you want them to go.
Cam, listen, no one's going to know how to spell where you can follow me. So it's cantusfirmus.com, cantus-firmus, CANTUS-FIRMUS.com. You can also search on your podcast feed for Cantus Firmus, and hopefully you won't just find stuff about music theory. But yes, that's me.
Awesome. And so beyond that, for me, remember to go to patreon.com/themadOnes to join us and join a conversation. And I think I'm going to set a Zoom up so we can talk about this subject together later. Also, go to wearethemadOnes.com/store. You can pick up a new t-shirt, an old t-shirt, a tank top, or a mug. The new mugs are really cool. I'm really excited about them. And I have to say, as we were sitting here talking, Cody ordered one of the mugs, and I want you to be like Cody.
Yeah, so you didn't give me enough notice, or I would have had a t-shirt or something for this podcast. I
made them, and I ordered the new shirt with the sample or whatever, and it's not here yet. I think it's coming tomorrow. I was so disappointed. Okay. But no, I'm stoked. I really like what we did. I really like what my wife did. I'm very proud of her. But if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at @HamCarlos. If you're listening and would rather watch when we are live Thursday nights at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, unless something crazy happens like today, youtube.com/themadOnes. That's the best way if you want to be a part of the conversation. So Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, all of these things, they don't hook up with StreamYard quite as I wish they would. But if you want to be a part of the conversation, youtube.com/themadOnes. And like I said, we're also on Odyssey and Rockfin. And finally, if you're watching and would rather not look at my face, you can go to any podcatcher, type in the Mad Ones, or you can go to wearethemadOnes.com and just listen straight from there and download it directly. Whatever you want to do. If you want to just archive everything I've said for the past, 6 years, you can do that. But that's it. That's all. Is there anything else you want to throw out there before I hit this outro button?
Let's do it, man. I'm ready to go to bed.
I feel you. So the rest of you, lovely people, and Quest, I love you, buddy.
I got one thing. People want to watch you. You're doing something right after this.
Yeah. I'm. If he hasn't given up already, I'm supposed to be going on to the Propaganda Report with Brad Binkley. You can watch that on Rockfin. You can watch that on YouTube. Just search for Brad Binkley and it'll come up. And it'll also be on Twitter. So I'm gonna go jump into that now. But as it were, dear listeners, you have a chance to be a light in the world, so go light it up.